Over the past 50 years, immigration into the United States, resulting in a high concentration of foreign-born students in public, effects of immigration on the quality of public education, the educational outcomes of US-born students, and the perceived cost that immigrants may impose on public schools. Some of these perceived challenges are due to immigrants' diverse cultural backgrounds, their limited knowledge of the US educational system, their lower than average household income, and the fact that many speak English as a second language. Taken together, these perceptions have led many to believe that the challenges immigrants face in assimilation may require additional school resources, which could be taken away from US-born students, hampering their success in the classroom. Our comprehensive 10-year study of Florida K-12 public schools offers valuable insight into this important question. We study how the presence of immigrant students affects US-born students and find that exposure to immigrant students on average has positive effect on the academic achievement of US-born students. Moving from a classroom with very few immigrants to one with a substantial immigrant presence actually increases math scores and reading scores of US-born students in a sizable way. Most notably, this positive effect is twice as large for disadvantaged US-born students, including Black students and those from lower socioeconomic background. We also explored potential mechanisms for the positive effect that immigrants' presence in classroom has on US-born students. One area of focus was the role of immigrant family cultural orientation for academic achievement. Students from cultures that emphasize self-control and delayed gratification, such as Asian and Asian American, tend to outperform non-immigrant students with similar socioeconomic backgrounds. Our analysis shows results consistent with the hypothesis that exposure to students with these traits positively impact US-born students' own attitude towards schools. We also studied the impact of disciplinary behavior in the classroom. Especially in low-income schools, immigrant students are less disruptive than their US-born peers. Less disruptive behavior makes the classroom environment more conducive to learning for all students. Especially in the classroom where US-born students are disadvantaged, immigrant students often outperform their peers and appear to serve as positive role models. In schools with more affluent US-born students, instead, the immigrants are generally poorer than their US-born classmates. Even in these circumstances, when immigrant students have lower average academic performance than affluent US-born students, their presence doesn't negatively affect these higher performing students. This suggests that cultural attributes and attitudes of immigrant students enhance the learning environment for all students, but especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Rather than placing a burden on the educational system, immigrants' diversity appears to enhance it. Immigrant innovation is economically vital to the United States. 50% of US startups valued at $1 billion or more have at least one immigrant founder, and immigrant-owned firms generate more patents per worker. Immigrant-founded firms further employ many US workers and contribute greatly to the US economy. A diverse educational environment helps all students, immigrant and non-immigrant alike, to thrive and to develop foundational skills that will allow them to be productive workers that contribute to US economic growth. Embracing diversity in the classroom means embracing a prosperous future for all Americans.
US policymakers have been working hard to build a strategic relationship with India in order to develop a counterweight to the People's Republic of China. India would seem like a natural partner in this endeavor. In recent years, China has repeatedly violated India's borders and has stymied Indian-led initiatives at various international forums. As the US engages in strategic competition with China, and as we seek to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific, the logic is straightforward. The adversary of our adversary should be our friend. But the promise that India holds for advancing US interests is far greater than China alone. The reality is that whether China is in the picture or not, India has simply become too important to ignore. Today, India is home to 1 in 5 people in the world, making it the most populous country on Earth. It boasts the world's fastest growing economy, and its commitment to democracy has provided decades of political order for a diverse populace. And while China increasingly demands US attention, India, like the US, also seeks stable and reliable partners in Central Asia and the Middle East. The people-to-people linkages between the US and India are also critical. Nearly 1 in 2 Americans will be treated by a medical doctor of Indian origin. Almost every major American tech company relies on Indian immigrants. People of Indian origin are about 1.5% of the US population, but are estimated to provide between 6 to 8% of the US tax base. The future of American innovation, the key driver of our economy, will depend on our immigration policies with India. And yet the two countries need to work together to stem the flow of undocumented Indian immigration and human trafficking. In 2023, more than 100,000 Indians were caught at the southern border, making India the 3rd largest source country after Mexico and China for undocumented border crossings. The relationship between these two countries is far from a true strategic partnership. This is because for decades following India's independence in 1947, leaders in both countries viewed their counterparts skeptically, creating an atmosphere of mistrust that pervaded through both countries' foreign policy establishments. Under the leadership of President George W. Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and with the guidance of Hoover Fellows like Condoleezza Rice, Philip Zelikow, and David Mulford, the US and India concluded a historic civil nuclear agreement that proved such hesitations could be overcome. But the US-India relationship is not yet on firm footing. In recent years, the United States' efforts to prioritize its relationship with India have been undercut by basic blunders. US leaders continue to take inconsistent positions on India's commitment to democracy and human rights, publicly voicing concern for India's democratic record, only for other US leaders in the same administration to immediately walk back those comments. Such inconsistencies suggest a lack of mature understanding of India's politics and culture among the ranks of US scholarly and foreign policy experts. The US has not nurtured expertise on India to an adequate extent, with most major universities only recently creating India programs or offering any India courses. Only a handful of student, industry, or military exchange programs exist between the two countries, and because of this lack of understanding, both sides still fear that the other will reverse on important issues such as economic integration, defense cooperation, and in their approaches to the People's Republic of China. Therefore, it's critical for American policymakers and leaders to develop a deeper understanding of India's political, economic, and social landscape. Here at the Hoover Institution's Huntington Program on Strengthening US-India Relations, our scholars are rigorously engaged in analyzing India's foreign policy, domestic political economy, and encouraging reforms that bring about prosperity and promote freedom. We also seek to advance the US-India relationship by proposing and fostering collaborative projects between the two countries in areas such as defense, energy, and innovation. Not to be forgotten, our scholars examine the issues facing the growing diaspora as well. The relationship between the United States and India will likely shape the trajectory of freedom and prosperity in the 21st century. Our two countries share common democratic roots, are committed to free markets, and seek to advance humanity through innovation and technological development, from advances in education and healthcare to energy independence. These shared traits cannot be taken for granted. In an age where the virtue of freedom is constantly called into question, the US and India need to forge a strong partnership based on not just a common rival, but on mutual trust and understanding.
Today, policymakers look to roll back financial regulations, hoping to drive up entrepreneurship, boost economic growth, and increase wages. But without an end to repeated bailouts, the country's financial system risks a crisis on a scale that could ultimately dwarf that of 2008's Great Recession. For over 40 years, U.S. authorities have repeatedly bailed out failing banks and other financial institutions, creating an increasingly fragile system. During the 2008 financial crisis, banks, like Citibank and Bank of America, financial institutions like AIG and Goldman Sachs, and mortgage companies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were deemed too big to fail. U.S. authorities stepped in to keep those entities from going under, with cash infusions or relief programs. These policies incentivize financial institutions to engage in excessively risky behaviors, knowing full well that the U.S. authorities will be there to rescue them if their gambles fail to pay off. High-risk, high-reward strategies can lead to large payouts for the banks when those investments succeed. When they don't, banks can sidestep the consequences. The government keeps them afloat and shifts the losses to the taxpayers. Heads, the banks win. Tails, you lose. When financial institutions do not expect government bailouts, investors and decision makers reap the rewards from successful investments, but also shoulder the consequences when investments fail. In a healthy financial system, decision makers have skin in the game. It is the possibility of failure that constrains excessive risk-taking and encourages more prudent decision-making. The Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 was meant to prevent future crises like that of 2008. However, the 2,300-page piece of legislation is burdensome and complicated for banks to follow. The 2,300-page piece of legislation is burdensome and complicated for banks to follow. Those costly regulations have induced bank lending to small businesses to fall and caused the disappearance of numerous small banks. Worst of all, it cemented and codified the Federal Reserve as financially responsible to institutions deemed systemically important and therefore too big to fail, exemplified most recently when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in March 2023 and federal regulators even protected large, sophisticated, uninsured depositors. This ongoing bailout pattern has created a deeply entrenched bailout culture in the United States. Deregulation may solve some of the problems created by the Dodd-Frank Act by eliminating some of the costly regulatory apparatus which creates barriers to entry, impedes efficient allocation of credit, and slows economic growth. But rolling back regulatory constraints on excessive risk-taking without eliminating the expectation of bailouts that incentivize it only exacerbates the problem. What can be done? Credibility is key. Regulators and policymakers cannot merely promise to end bailouts because they have repeatedly shown they will bail out banks. If investors don't think they have skin in the game, they will continue adopting high-risk investment strategies. One option is to require banks to fund themselves more with equity and less by borrowing from depositors and others, forcing shareholders to absorb greater losses before taxpayer money is even an option. Another option is to force banks to borrow from larger investors who the government could credibly commit to not bail out. Such investors would have the incentive and ability to constrain excessive risk-taking. Finally, clawback provisions, which compel executives to surrender past earnings should their institutions fail, create a powerful incentive for prudence by forcing decision makers to have more skin in the game. Reducing the regulatory burdens of Dodd-Frank can foster growth if implemented correctly, but the sequence in reform is critical. It's easy to slash regulations. It's difficult to implement policy reforms to fix the perverse incentive system. It is essential to end the bailout culture first.
Thomas Jefferson famously noted that a well-informed citizenry is not only the best defense against tyranny, but is the heart of a dynamic democracy. American democracy today operates much like it did at our nation's founding. Citizens periodically vote directly for representatives who then make decisions at the state, local, or federal level on their behalf. But what if, as a voter, you don't consider yourself well enough informed? Today, your only choice is to vote anyway, to become more informed before you vote, or to abstain from voting altogether. But there's another option that might be worth exploring. Liquid democracy. Liquid democracy is a concept dating back to the 19th century, but it has gained traction in recent years as our lives have become more digital. In liquid democracy, voters retain the option to vote for themselves, but those who feel insufficiently informed can give their vote to someone else to cast on their democracy. Voters retain the option to vote for themselves, but those who feel insufficiently informed can give their vote to someone else to cast on their behalf. It's a hybrid between representative democracy and direct democracy, and digital technology makes it feasible to build at scale for the first time. Today, a variety of organizations are actively experimenting with different ways to delegate decision-making power to others. Major investment firms like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard now allow shareholders to delegate their votes through voting choice programs. In blockchain, token-based systems allow people to vote digitally, to buy, sell, or lend voting power, and to delegate their votes to others. AI companies including Anthropic, Meta, and OpenAI are running public experiments to delegate decision-making power to randomly sampled citizen assemblies to provide guidance on what AI chatbots should and shouldn't say, or what they can and cannot do. The real-world applications for liquid democracy could have potential. In California, for example, ballot initiatives, which are chances for voters to make decisions together outside the legislative process, can be so numerous that it's difficult to be informed on each one. Many voters decline to vote on many of them, or vote somewhat randomly. Liquid democracy could allow voters to give their voting power to someone more informed, which might help to push through the best initiatives and vote down the bad ones. While the idea of delegating votes might sound attractive in the real world, especially if it might lead to a better informed and more civic-minded citizenry, theoretical research suggests there could be significant challenges too. To figure out whether liquid democracy works well and how it could work better, we need to test it out in a real-world, high-stakes setting and see what actually happens. Fortunately, blockchain startups are actively doing this, and we can learn from what they've experienced. One of the biggest concerns is preventing too much voting power from concentrating in a small number of people, so-called superdelegates. Even if voters can reclaim their individual vote back, it risks concentrating too much unaccountable power in the hands of the few. Finding the right delegate can be its own challenge as well. Making informed decisions about who should be the next U.S. president, U.S. senator, state senator, governor, sheriff, county clerk, or town mayor is without a doubt a lot to ask. But finding someone informed to whom you can delegate your vote may be equally as hard, which might explain one of liquid democracy's other significant challenges. Our study is the first research project in political science to leverage these natural experiments in liquid democracy that are going on today in blockchain. Collecting comprehensive data on liquid democracy and voting that covers over 250,000 voters and more than 1,700 proposals across 18 of the largest Ethereum-based DAOs, we find both challenge and promise to liquid democracy. First, in blockchain-based organizations that use liquid democracy, only 17% of voting power gets delegated, similar to turnout in many local elections. And those with delegated power often fail to vote, with delegate participation rates around 33%. This points to a potential problem. Even when given more flexible voting options, many people still choose not to participate. Low overall rates of participation contribute to a second challenge. Voting power ends up concentrated in a relatively small number of superdelegates, threatening to undo the decentralization of these projects if voters do not monitor their delegates closely. But there are also signs of promise. We find that delegation is bottoms up more than top down. Smaller token holders are more likely to delegate their votes than larger token holders, which is consistent with the hope that liquid democracy can induce people who have weak incentives to pay attention and participate to still have their votes counted. Delegates with a better track record of participating attract more votes, suggesting that token holders are not delegating their votes entirely at random. Moreover, there's evidence that thoughtful design can help address these challenges. Delegation programs that create convenient online user interfaces and offer information on potential delegates, including their voting positions and their track records, show substantial increases in participation, increasing overall rates of delegation by roughly 25%. The world is undergoing tremendous technological change, and it would be strange to think we cannot harness these changes to improve the way we govern ourselves. But the challenge is figuring out which ideas are genuine improvements and which are ill-advised. Although the future of liquid democracy and its applicability into real-world civic engagement remains uncertain for the time being, what is clear is that liquid democracy and the idea of delegated voting may become increasingly significant in the digital age. Whether it's financial institutions, online platforms, or perhaps online governance, liquid democracy offers both promising possibilities and cautionary lessons about the challenges of translating democratic ideals into practical reality.
In the aftermath of World War II, the United States unsurprisingly emerged as the undisputed leader in scientific research and technological innovation. After all, most scientific and technological advancements typically occur in open and diverse environments, in a free and prosperous society capable of attracting and retaining the best talent. The confluence of conditions resulted in some of the most groundbreaking scientific discoveries, technological innovations, and propelled the United States economically through the second half of the 20th century. However, as America creeps closer to the mid-21st century, the landscape of global research and development has shifted. Some countries look to challenge and potentially surpass the United States economically, technologically, and militarily, with no regard on how to get there. The past 20 years has seen US competitors exploit America's openness through espionage and intellectual property theft, often forcing their citizens to be accomplices. Over the same time period, the number of Americans pursuing STEM field degrees has decreased, which means the United States continues to have to look abroad for an ever-increasing demand of scientists and engineers. But the United States is no longer the sole attractive destination for top-tier talent and must compete with other nations for the best and the brightest minds. In an era where technological superiority translates to economic prosperity, military capacity, and national security, the United States cannot afford to lose its place as the world's leader in research and development. The US must take strategic actions to sustain a vibrant and robust R&D ecosystem lasting generations. And it must do so in a balanced way, safeguarding our secrets while staying true to our values as an open society. First and foremost, the United States must remain committed to the open and collaborative nature and values of scientific inquiry and research, rather than resort to protectionism. Values like trust, transparency, and academic freedom are the foundation of fast advancement and innovation. Federally funded research programs at universities and national laboratories have done well by reinforcing the tenets of President Reagan's 1985 National Security Decision Directive 189, which ensures full access to information, free collaboration, access to user facilities, and exchange of personnel. Continuing to do so will encourage our allies and like-minded partners to collaborate and innovate with the United States for mutual benefit rather than being slowed by unilateral protection mechanisms. Legally binding agreements to establish global norms and standards for international collaboration in the spirit of NSDD 189 can again unleash the power of open collaborations. Frameworks modeled after initiatives like the Budapest Open Access Initiative would allow vetted nations fast-tracked access to the research of participating member nations, fostering a secure yet open environment for innovation. Only non-member nations would be subject to more stringent review processes and have limited access to data, personnel, and facilities, encouraging nations to open themselves up to the vetting process and become participant nations. An international pre-check system for scientific collaboration, similar to an airport pre-check lane, amongst participating nations would enjoy streamlined approval processes for joint research projects, shared data, and talent exchanges, further incentivizing countries to adopt the principles, values, and norms of open research. It would also relieve US research institutions from administrative burden to check and to vet, and redirect valuable resources towards R&D again. While committed to principles of open research, the US should continue to develop robust measures to safeguard pre-publication results, prevent unauthorized use of research, and uphold ethical standards in scientific inquiry. America must also cultivate homegrown STEM talent while continuing to develop international researchers. Expanding the Fulbright US Student Program, a government-funded international exchange program, will increase opportunities and mutual understanding between the United States and other countries through educational and cultural exchange, as well as create clearer pathways for talented foreign researchers to build careers in America. A next-generation GI Bill type program can bring talent into the STEM field that never thought about going there. Federal investment in cutting-edge research infrastructure ensures that America's scientific facilities remain the best in the world, able to adapt to changing technological needs, whether in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, or other emerging scientific fields. In today's interconnected world, scientific leadership cannot be achieved in isolation. By implementing these measures, the United States can create a dynamic ecosystem that safeguards its innovative edge and foster groundbreaking discoveries with the potential to benefit all mankind.
Despite many reasons to be optimistic about the future of our environment, a recent study reports that 75% of young adults find the future frightening due to climate concerns. 45% of that same group reported that climate anxiety negatively impacts their day-to-day lives. Where does this pervasive pessimism about our environment come from? In fact, the United States and other countries have made great strides when it comes to air pollution, water quality, biodiversity, and even climate mortality. Since the 1960s, sulfur dioxide emissions in the US dropped from 30 million tons to 2 million tons annually. The percentage of rivers considered too polluted to fish improved from 40% to 15%. Endangered species like bald eagles and gray wolves have made remarkable comebacks. Even the California condor has returned to the skies after nearly a century-long absence. And globally, climate-related deaths resulting from hurricanes, floods, and other disasters have declined over the past 100 years. So why the disconnect? Why do we see such widespread environmental pessimism in the face of measurable progress? The answer may lie in how environmental information is communicated. A troubling pattern has emerged over the past 30 years. Environmental science research papers consistently use more subjective language than non-environmental papers. This subjectivity manifests in three specific ways: through personal feelings or biased language, using words like alarming, through unclear metrics, using words like massive, and through normative policy prescriptions with phrases like urgent action is needed. My ongoing research suggests this tendency towards subjectivity is rewarded. Articles using more subjective language receive more citations than articles that don't. The boost from doubling subjective language is equivalent to the boost from doubling a researcher's experience. In other words, subjectivity appears to be worth as much as the scientist's experience in his or her field. This suggests that environmental science is operating within a system that rewards language linked to emotion, to advocacy, and to activism, as much as it rewards experience conducting science. Such a system can erode public trust in science and ultimately can lead to misguided policies. In today's world, researchers often face pressure from journals, media, and even financial backers to emphasize punchy and dramatic narratives over objective analysis. Even the academic publish or perish model can encourage advocacy that might be subtle, imperceptible, or unintentional to the scientists using subjective language. A new technology may offer a way out. My research team is developing machine learning tools that detect and measure subjective language in scientific papers. These tools could help journal editors maintain higher standards of objectivity and allow for systematic auditing of scientific communication. Scientific objectivity is vital for effective policymaking, especially if we are to learn the best ways to promote a healthy environment. When science, the communication of it, becomes conflated with advocacy, the chance that well-meaning policymakers make decisions based on emotion instead of evidence increases. The stakes are high because environmental policies can cost trillions and have legacies spanning generations. Objective analysis helps us recognize and competently address problems like air pollution that pessimists of previous generations thought were intractable. We need similar clarity to rightly tackle new and emotionally charged environmental concerns in the 21st century. If we don't prioritize objectivity, we risk misallocation of resources by overemphasizing certain problems while overlooking others. We risk further eroding public trust in scientific institutions. That would make it harder to use discipline and prudence when prioritizing and addressing environmental challenges. We also risk a self-reinforcing cycle where pessimism drives alarmist communication, which in turn breeds more pessimism. The path forward requires a return to fundamental scientific principles. Science advances through the disciplined focus on proposing falsifiable claims that can be tested and potentially rejected, not through subjective statements that can never be proven or disproven. The good news is that large language models can be used to identify and promote objectivity in scientific communication. This tool could help ensure environmental policy is guided by evidence rather than emotion, leading to better outcomes and a more optimistic outlook for our planet.
When Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, there were mixed reactions in the United States and throughout the West. Some viewed it as a straightforward global infrastructure program. Others saw it as little more than grandiose propaganda. Within a few years, however, many became concerned that it was part of a larger effort to expand Chinese geopolitical influence through a Sino-centric global trade network, and by loading emerging economies with burdensome debt. Today, the Belt and Road Initiative has emerged as a founding pillar of China and Xi Jinping's long-term strategy to reshape the world order, one dominated by Chinese notions of state-determined political rights, economic development, and common security. Through China's Belt and Road Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative, Beijing hopes to diminish Western values in international bodies, dissolve the United States' network of alliances, knock the US dollar off its pedestal, and eliminate Washington's technological edge. In a 2023 speech, Xi himself proclaimed that China was already leading the way to reform the international system with the help of these four initiatives. Despite such statements and China's initiatives, many American officials have dismissed the writing on the wall, especially after some of China's progress, including diplomatic efforts, have failed or backfired in recent years. U.S. leaders and policymakers cannot assume these setbacks are indicative of a permanent downward trend. Instead, America must recognize Beijing's initiatives and efforts are comprehensive in nature, well-resourced, global, and most importantly, strategically designed to support Xi's long-term vision. To succeed against this vision, the United States must offer its own vision for the international community, one that paints America, not China, as the agent for positive change. America must also learn from China's playbook to fully understand what the U.S. is up against diplomatically, economically, and even militarily. Diplomatically, China has been more engaged and more heavily invested on the global stage than the United States. China has more embassies and representative offices than any other country. Its diplomats speak frequently at conferences and publish streams of articles to promote their vision. All of this is further supported by its wide-reaching state media networks like CGTN. China relentlessly portrays itself as a welcome agent of anti-colonial and anti-imperial change, while painting the United States as the defender of an unpopular and imperial status quo. In one recent academic study, even though international audiences initially preferred American values and principles, exposure to effective Chinese messaging shifted their views. Economically, although Belt and Road financing has dropped sharply since 2016, the initiative still encompasses over 100 countries, and China is on the cusp of leading the world's deployment of green technologies and digital infrastructure. Xi Jinping has also leveraged Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an opportunity to push de-dollarization of the global economy, hoping to advance the use of its own and others' currencies. China has also expanded its military reach, establishing its first military logistics base in Djibouti, with plans for an additional 10 bases and support facilities. In Africa, China brought over 100 senior military officials from nearly 50 African nations to its China-Africa Peace and Security Forum, agreeing to hold joint military exercises. And China's foreign ministry reports over 100 countries, regional organizations, and international organizations support China's global security initiative. All of this threatens to undermine, or at least challenge, the military alliances developed by the United States and its security partners. The alternative vision that China offers resonates with many non-Western nations. Xi's enticing sales pitch capitalizes on other nations' strong desire for national sovereignty and a greater voice in global affairs. If successful, Beijing's efforts could fundamentally alter global governance and replace universal values with state-determined rights, transparent institutions with opaque ones, and rule of law with rule by decree. Success for the United States means that Washington cannot simply play defense and support the status quo. It must articulate its own unique and positive vision for change, one that preserves what's worth keeping, core democratic values, open markets, and free enterprise, yet still reforms and transforms in meaningful ways. New relationships must be built. Emerging and middle-income economies deserve a seat at the table and a voice in decision-making. Existing partnerships must be strengthened. Bolstering diplomatic ties, deepening economic partnerships, and recommitting to security frameworks will be crucial to dampen China's appeal. Last but not least, the United States must demonstrably prove through its own actions that open, free, and democratic societies provide the best pathway to a better and more prosperous future than any alternative.
If there is one lesson America should learn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's that deterrence would have been a lot cheaper than war. Deterrence served the United States well during most of the Cold War, but in recent years, the United States and other democracies seem to have gotten worse at it. Deterrence is an act of psychology. to persuade your adversary to desist or delay their plans for war by demonstrating that you and your allies have the capabilities and the resolve to effectively resist their use of force. It's about persuading your adversary that war will be far more costly than they should like to bear. As China's paramount leader Xi Jinping intensifies his calls for unifying Taiwan with mainland China, even by force, it might be easy to dismiss those calls as idle threats that don't require more than cosmetic changes in our deterrence posture. After all, Chinese leaders have been making threats for decades. But unlike China's late leader Deng Xiaoping, who said China could wait 1,000 years for unification, Xi Jinping has said the issue can no longer be passed from one generation to another. He has called for the United States to break from decades of policy and publicly support Chinese unification. In a speech to the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping praised Mao Zedong's surprise attack on U.S. forces in Korea, signaling his readiness to go to war under what he seems to believe are similar circumstances. Most concerning of all, he has steadily intensified military activity around Taiwan over the past few years, launching missiles over the island and demonstrating the ability to impose a blockade. His Ministry of Defense recently said that Taiwan's leaders now have, quote, a sword hanging over their heads. The ministry further vowed that pressure will only increase like a ratchet, and that China's military actions, quote, will be pushed forward until the Taiwan issue is completely resolved. American leaders and policymakers can no longer afford to dismiss these sentiments as posturing. The United States must step up and do everything within its power to deter a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan and thwart Xi's ambitions head on. Failure to do so would be devastating to American power, security, and prosperity. Taiwan is rated as the most democratic state in Asia and the 8th most fully democratic state in the world, ahead of the United States. If Beijing coercively annexed Taiwan, it would extinguish the hopes of millions of Chinese people for a more liberal form of government at home. It would also undermine faith in U.S. credibility as an ally, leading many people in Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and Australia to argue it would be better, as Hoover Senior Fellow Larry Diamond put it, to surf the wave of China's rising hegemony rather than to be drowned by it. Finally, it would undermine U.S. technological and economic dominance. Taiwan is the world's leading producer of the most advanced silicon chips, chips that power smartphones, medical devices, defense weapons systems, and artificial intelligence. Were China to gain control of Taiwan's chip factories intact or even damaged, Beijing could either gain near monopolistic power over this crucial technology or cause supply chain disruptions that would compromise America's military and technological edge. All of this, however, is avoidable so long as the United States, its allies, Japan and Australia, and Taiwan itself take appropriate action now. These nations must first make military deterrence their explicit and primary goal. Diplomacy and economic sanctions can help, but won't work in the absence of credible hard power and a stated resolve to use it. The U.S. should maintain investment in legacy systems, especially submarines and long-range bombers, even as it builds futuristic autonomous weapons. Adequate munitions stockpiles, anti-ship missiles, and loitering drones can threaten to turn the Taiwan Strait into a boiling moat, inhospitable to China's Navy. The U.S. must also work more tightly with its allies in Taiwan to conduct realistic training exercises to defeat an attempted blockade or invasion. Fortunately, we don't need to match China ship for ship or plane for plane. In amphibious warfare, geography heavily favors the defender. Moderately higher investments in asymmetric weapons can offset China's massive investments in ships and planes and ballistic missiles, making the cost of invasion unbearably high for Xi Jinping. Preventing war through strength is far less costly than fighting one through necessity. The United States must prepare for deterrence now or risk catastrophic conflict later. Taiwan's destiny, with its continental and regional global implications for democracy, national sovereignty, and prosperity, depend on it.
In 1823, during his annual address to Congress, President James Monroe warned European powers not to meddle in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. Simultaneously, President Monroe emphasized that the United States should avoid European entanglements and prioritize its own hemisphere. What became known as the Monroe Doctrine, the cornerstone of American foreign policy for much of the 19th and 20th century, is neither a call to isolationism nor a call for imperialism. The Monroe Doctrine serves instead as a reminder that, to paraphrase Secretary of State George Shultz, American foreign policy begins in our own backyard, our own neighborhood. Today, though, this strategic outlook has been ignored, forgotten, and even worse, abandoned. The United States finds itself locked in a new era of great power competition. We face no shortage of geopolitical challenges. Strategic rivals like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran represent serious, coordinated threats to the United States, its allies, and global stability. Now, it's necessary for the United States to dedicate time and resources to addressing those threats throughout the world, but doing so at the expense of America's own neighbors and neighborhood is a grave mistake. If the United States is to successfully face its challenges and confront its rivals, it must rededicate itself to the strategic orientation of the Monroe Doctrine. America must put the Americas first. The United States must prioritize diplomatic relationships, military alliances, and economic partnerships with its neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. President Ronald Reagan understood the Western Hemisphere's strategic importance in his fight against the Soviet Union. To effectively wage the Cold War, Reagan forged strong relationships and partnerships in the region. He engaged in high-profile diplomacy by making trips to Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Honduras, and he hosted key Latin American leaders at the White House. He developed economic initiatives like the Caribbean Basin Initiative, and he laid the groundwork for NAFTA. He encouraged transitions to civilian rule in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay, and he rolled back the spread of communism with calculated covert action. Such a comprehensive strategy, however, is missing in today's world of great power competition. While the United States has paid little attention to Latin America in recent years, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have made significant economic and political inroads. China has partnered with 22 countries in the Western Hemisphere, investing in infrastructure projects and increasing trade by nearly 3,000%. While economic cooperation has allowed the Chinese Communist Party to gain footholds across many Latin American countries, the Chinese Communist Party also exports advanced surveillance technology to authoritarian regimes in Venezuela and Cuba. And the Chinese Communist Party now provides drug cartels with not only the chemicals and equipment needed to manufacture narcotics, but also the money laundering services to wash their profits. Russia, meanwhile, is strengthening its regional ties, particularly with Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Moscow has also flexed its anti-American, anti-Western influence through its economic partnership with Brazil, a founding member of BRICS, which purchases Russian diesel fuel to fund Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, circumventing Western economic sanctions. Hezbollah, Iran's terrorist proxy, deals arms, launders money, among other illicit activities in South America, funneling millions to the Middle East to finance terrorism. North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un continues to foster relationships with Brazil and Cuba and has recently permitted the opening of a brand new Nicaraguan embassy. Now, despite the despotic quartet's regional advancements, most Latin American countries still view the United States in a positive light. The National Intelligence Estimate for Latin America finds that the region would be most open to U.S. engagement on shared interests including education, economic investments, and renewable energy. Following Colombia's admission in 2017, Argentina's President Javier Milei has applied for global partner status with NATO, and in May 2024, Argentina and the United States held joint naval exercises for the first time in 14 years. The United States must advance these encouraging developments. America must dispense with non-binding status quo forums dedicated to pledges and declaration under President Joe Biden's America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Instead, America must seek binding and sustainable long-term economic cooperation that leads to regional integration, joint security measures that address 21st century challenges, and cultural exchanges that strengthen our hemispheric relations. In fact, we should engage in what George Shultz referred to as gardening. We should tend and cultivate diplomatic relations with our neighbors through constant, proactive engagement. The President should visit our neighbors more often and tend to the garden. The United States must actively engage its neighbors to ensure long-term prosperity and stability. Like Ronald Reagan, policymakers must again align national power with grand strategic purpose. And it starts in the neighborhood.
America's presidential history is a tale of generational shifts, with each cohort leaving its mark on the nation's trajectory. Our first two presidents, Washington and Adams, and a majority of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were all from the Liberty generation that guided the Republic through its arguably most vulnerable and formative years. Fast forward to the Lost generation, born between 1883 and 1900. This generation steered America through World War II, the Great Depression, and the early years of the Cold War. They, in turn, passed the baton to the greatest generation, born between 1908 and 1924. JFK, LBJ, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Bush 41 navigating America through the end of the Cold War, presiding over significant civil rights advancements, and even putting a man on the moon. The greatest generation's 32-year reign from 1961 to 1993 seemed a fitting capstone to their contributions. However, as we near the end of the 2024 election, we face an unprecedented scenario. Historically, generational leadership lasts around 30 years before the next generation comes of age and steps into the highest seat in government. But not so today. The baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, have almost exclusively occupied the Oval Office since 1993 and threaten to extend their hold on the presidency into a fourth decade. Since Bill Clinton's inauguration, the boomers' tenure has already surpassed previous generational cycles, and the 2024 election offers no respite. Both major candidates are boomers, ensuring this generation's grip on power will extend for at least another 4 years. The extended boomer dominance in the White House raises critical questions about generational accountability, as well as the present and future challenges facing our nation. For it's under the boomers' leadership that several concerning trends have emerged or worsened, putting America in a precarious position. First, and perhaps most concerning and consequential, is our mounting national debt. Neil Ferguson, a historian and Hoover Senior Fellow, has authored what he calls Ferguson's Law, that any great power which spends more on interest payments towards the national debt than it does on defense will not stay great for very long. The Habsburg monarchy, the Ottoman Empire, even the British Empire all suffered this fate. Under the boomers' reign, the national debt has ballooned from $4 trillion in 1993 to $35 trillion in 2024 and growing. Ferguson's Law will be put to the test this year as the Congressional Budget Office has stated that debt interest will be 3.1% of America's GDP and defense spending only 3.0%. Then there's entitlement reform. Longer life expectancy, higher health care costs, and lack of political will to reform entitlement programs have made Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid unsustainable for future generations and looking at bankruptcy unless elected leaders stop playing political football. Lastly, the United States under the boomer generation has decidedly mixed foreign policy results. While there have been success stories, such as confronting the scourges of AIDS and malaria in Africa, failures in Somalia and Rwanda, the rise of ISIS, the seemingly forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the inability to thwart Putin's ambitions, and escalating tensions with China all plague this generation's record. The question is, can the next boomer president break from these patterns and address these issues which their generation has either created or exacerbated? To tackle this dilemma, how about a boomer debate? Whether it's the two boomer candidates or candidates from newer generations in future elections, the long-term consequences of boomer policies are coming home to roost, and they must be debated openly and in the least partisan way before the damage is irreversible. Most importantly, the idea of generational accountability needs to take root in the American psyche. While we talk about age limits for politicians, we must also consider the consequences when one generation remains in power too long and may no longer represent the majority of the country, its people, their interests, their perspectives, or their values. It is imperative that Americans demand more from their boomer candidates to ensure that the extended boomer presidency becomes a period of reflection and correction, not delegation and procrastination. The next president, regardless of party, must commit to addressing the shortcomings of their generation's legacy in order to chart a course towards a more fiscally responsible, globally engaged, and enduring America. Okay, boomers?
Are you scared of AI? Are you excited about AI? Or maybe a little bit of both? AI has the potential to make day-to-day life easier and more convenient than ever before. And it has the potential to take control of systems, to be weaponized in ways that could create catastrophic destruction. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 were a scale event, killing 3,000 people and costing $50 billion in their immediate wake. The catastrophic risks associated with AI, especially weaponized AI, could go far beyond the scale of 9/11. So, how can we prevent, or at least mitigate, the risks of a weaponized biological, chemical, or cybernetic AI? What can we do to prevent a loss of control over an AI system whose power and kinds of intelligence might exceed our own in some ways? And how do we do that while still encouraging the rapid development of artificial intelligence that could help our whole society? Well, the first step both policymakers and industry leaders must take is they need to agree on how to think about AI. Right now, on the one hand, we have the doomers who see only risks and nightmares. On the other hand, there are bloomers who only see through rose-colored glasses. It becomes another culture war. One side anxious about change, the other side exalting innovation. New and transformative technologies, like nuclear power, often need to find a middle ground between utopian and dystopian futures. Those with public responsibility have to recognize how little we currently know, how much we have yet to discover. They have to acknowledge that there's risk, but they have to find a way to pursue innovation. So the best path forward, then, is likely to go forward while managing risks. After all, if we don't fully understand AI's potential, it's next to impossible to have effective oversight. And there is a precedent that's already on the books without a big new law. We already have laws about product liability. But producers facing potentially huge liability risks will need safe harbors that can help them and show them the way to advance. And government can help with that if it will work with the innovators. Let me introduce another idea to you. We do need to explore the dangers, but with careful controls. We explore the dangers to learn how to counter them. The best counter to bad AI will probably be good AI. We also must explore ways to use AI as a counter to any nation, like Iran, Russia, or North Korea, or any individual for that matter, looking to weaponize artificial intelligence against us. Just as dangerous pathogens are studied in secure biolabs, and conventional weapons tested safely on proving grounds, advanced defense work can allow engineers and scientists to assess the greatest dangers posed by the worst people. But that means we have to be able to conduct the most dangerous AI research safely to know how to counter it. As we study and learn more, independent AI safety institutes and organizations can help serve as trusted intermediaries. These safety institutes stand between both government and the private sector with insight into both working with the companies but informing government. They can potentially foster innovation, help proliferate the technology, and inform government so it doesn't have to stifle innovation with overregulation in pursuit of control. To move forward wisely, the United States must forge and maintain strong relationships with the private sector, where the dynamism is going on, and it also has to build lasting public-private partnerships so that the United States and its friends can remain ahead of our competitors. Doing so will protect ourselves against the risk AI poses, but it also allows AI to flourish in the ways that can improve our society, increase our prosperity and our economic mobility, and give us the brightest future we can have.
Public universities generally can't punish students based on what the students say. That's true even if the student's speech is deeply offensive to many. Public universities are branches of the government, and thus bound by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that public universities can only restrict speech based on its content in a handful of narrow, traditionally recognized exceptions. Classic examples of such unprotected speech are true threats of illegal conduct, intentional incitement to imminent and likely lawless action, and face-to-face targeted personal insults that are likely to start a fight. There is no exception for supposed hate speech, or even for advocacy of genocide. Students are free to call for the destruction of Israel, or for an even more forceful response by Israel in Gaza. If Iran detonates a nuclear bomb in Israel, students will be free to call for Israel to do the same to Iran, even if that means killing a vast number of Iranians. Likewise, in a future China-Taiwan conflict or some other foreign war. War and the mass killing it brings are regrettable facts of international affairs, and all Americans, students or not, have the equal right to defend and criticize acts of war. Private universities aren't bound by the First Amendment as such, because the First Amendment only applies to government actors. But many private universities have voluntarily adopted policies committing themselves to follow First Amendment principles. The private Yale University might not want to be seen as providing less protection than the public University of Connecticut. Indeed, California even has a state statute extending First Amendment protections to private university students. So, in practice, most private universities respect student free speech rights in much the same way as public institutions. The temptation to censor speech we hate is strong and understandable, but it's also dangerous. If we support censoring speech that offends us, eventually the views we support will be censored too. The best way of dealing with evil ideas is to argue against them, not to suppress them. Such counter-speech isn't a perfect solution, but it's better than the alternatives. To be sure, many universities have given in to the temptation to restrict speech in recent years, suppressing speech that some claim was racist or anti-gay or anti-trans or what have you. And part of human nature is what I call censorship envy. Once speech that offends one group is blocked, other groups will seek similar restrictions on speech that offends them. After all, who wants to be the chump who goes along with free speech principles when others are getting away with suppressing speech that they dislike? The solution to this sort of inconsistency, though, is to return to equal freedom of speech, not to level down towards equal suppression. But even public universities can impose content-neutral restrictions on the time, place, and manner of speech. They can, for instance, ban demonstrations that are unduly loud, or that block entrances to buildings. They can ban destroying campus property, physically assaulting invited speakers or fellow students, or occupying offices. Likewise, universities can forbid students from camping out in public spaces. Public spaces are supposed to be open to all students, not to some small group that chooses to take them over for its own purposes. But all such rules must be evenly applied based on what is being done, not what is being said. The same rules should apply whether it's a conservative group, a liberal group, or anyone else. Indeed, if a public university applies such rules in a content-based way, that itself would violate the First Amendment. Any restrictions that we support will soon be used by officials with whom we sharply disagree. Content-neutral restrictions that apply equally to everyone may make sense, whoever is applying them. But the power to suppress student speech based on its message is a dangerous power, one we shouldn't give to university officials any more than to other officials.
American democracy is in crisis. Political polarization and institutional distrust threaten the fabric of our republic. Some claim the United States is in an inevitable decline. But are we? Is it inevitable? Our constitutional republic has survived crises, civil war, societal unrest, and economic turmoil for nearly 3 centuries, while other states have been short-lived and collapsed into tyranny. Understanding the conditions from which democracy is born and thrives can determine whether our current crisis will lead to a decline and inform what corrections must be made to ensure American democracy continues to flourish. Global peace, prosperity, and liberty depend on it. Asked in 1787, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, what kind of government the United States will have, Benjamin Franklin famously replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." These words were laden with responsibility. Experiments in self-governance like those of ancient Rome and Athens were rare and asked much of citizens. Benjamin Franklin understood that and recognized our republic demands constant effort to keep it alive and to preserve our liberty and rights. Democracy demands much from us as citizens because unlike autocracies, there's no boss but ourselves. Citizens govern with reasoning. Kings and oligarchs dictate laws and prescribe cultural norms with little need to negotiate or bargain with their subjects. Constant compromise and negotiation are, however, integral to democracy. Yet only when certain necessary conditions pertain can civic bargaining take place, from which democracy can emerge. First, no boss. Citizens must accept the responsibility of governing themselves directly or through accountable representatives. States must ensure lawful and peaceful conditions, and the people must have ample opportunity to secure basic means of living. Collective self-governance by a citizenry must clearly define who is a citizen and who is not. Citizenship brings with it rights, but also duties. Being too inclusive can dilute the value of being a citizen. Being too exclusive can create resentment. The institutions of decision-making and conflict resolution must be well designed so they can be run by and accountable to the members of the democracy. The survival of democracy depends on citizens' ability to engage in good faith compromise. The creation and preservation of a common good must take precedence over unilateral demands for perfection. To negotiate in good faith, citizens must be able to see one another not as political enemies, but as civic friends, engaged in a shared enterprise, interested in finding common ground. And lastly, perpetuation of these conditions relies on civic education. Cultural values, institutional knowledge, and political and societal history must be passed down to future generations to take ownership in self-governance. These conditions, while necessary for democracy to emerge, must be robustly sustained for it to flourish. When these conditions break down, democracies face decline. When they are abandoned, democracies fail. There is a growing sense, however, that many of these conditions are weakening, but that should serve as a call to action rather than resignation. The United States has endured through many external and internal crises, and our Constitution was deliberately constructed to self-correct by restoring these conditions. Our Constitution was deliberately constructed to self-correct by restoring these conditions. At the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention, not everyone signed on. It was an imperfect document that did not answer every question or solve every issue. The institution of slavery, the most glaring among them. But Benjamin Franklin understood it was the best we could achieve at that moment, and a document that could evolve over time to address its imperfections. Quote, "I consent because I am not sure that this Constitution is not the best. The opinions I have had of its errors, I sacrifice to the public good." Franklin's message to the convention was one that emphasized sacrificing demands for perfection to achieve a common good, trusting that the Constitution was a framework for ongoing civic bargaining, and that issues like slavery, although unsettled, would eventually be resolved. The United States faces no shortage of challenges, but decline is only inevitable if we choose it. American democracy can still flourish through individual civic action, a recommitment to civic education, and the willingness to bargain with our fellow citizens so that we may continue to drive cultural, political, and legal change and enable peaceful transfers of power. The United States, with all its imperfections, has brought more liberty and prosperity to more people than the founders could have imagined. With courageous and thoughtful civic action from many individuals, with diverse interests, but a commitment to a common good, America will continue to thrive and shine as an example to the world.
In the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, freedom and democracy were on the rise, and communism was largely discredited. But in recent years, communism and its utopian dreams have regained popularity, particularly among Western youth who have never seen or experienced the brutal reality of its regimes. What then can be done to restore the truth about communism? What can be done to educate the younger generation about the inherently tyrannical and ruinous nature of the communist ideology? An ideology responsible for the world's 100 million people, death-induced famines, and forced labor camps. Throughout its history, the Hoover Institution has endeavored to record the truth about this deadly ideology. In my new book, 1990s, to save the history of Soviet communism. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the new Russian government opened the Soviet archives for the very first time. This created an opportunity to copy millions of previously secret files on Soviet communism and to illuminate its terrible consequences, including the unnecessary deaths of 20 million of its own people. As deputy director of the Hoover Institution at that time, I recognized this as a chance to realize a central mission of the Hoover Institution and its founder, Herbert Hoover. That mission has been to document dangerous ideologies like communism and its like-minded cousin, socialism, and in the process help promote peace, liberty, and prosperity for all. After connecting with Rudolf Pikoya, the newly appointed head of the Soviet archives, I proposed a collaborative project to copy and publish these newly opened archives. We sought to make them available to everyone without restriction and provide a better understanding of what really happened behind the Iron Curtain. During this 12-year project, we microfilmed over 10 million pages of previously unseen documents. For the first time, the complete history of the Soviet Union could finally be told. It could no longer be ignored, falsified, or effectively defended. It was all now a matter of record. The political workings of the Communist Party, the ruthless actions of the NKVD, Stalin's state police, the operations of the Gulag, the system of forced labor camps, and countless Soviet crimes, including the Katyn Forest massacre of Polish officers during World War II, the downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007, and the cover-up of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. All these and much more have been brought out into the light. The project faced staunch pushback in Russia, and surprisingly at home among some in the United States. Still suspicious of the West and opposed to sharing their archives with foreigners, many Russians, especially in the media, accused Pikoya of exploiting his own history and selling out his country. Critics in the United States mistakenly saw the project as an attempt to monopolize access to the Soviet archives and to use financial incentives to secure them. Despite this opposition, we persevered and eventually prevailed. Strong support from the Hoover Institution and its donors enable us to make our project a reality. The numerous benefits of this project continue even today. Hundreds of scholars have come to the Hoover Archives to use the collection. They have published dozens of scholarly works based on them. Two examples stand out. The Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Gulag, by Anne Applebaum, chronicles the history of the forced labor camps, what she has called the quintessential expression of the Soviet system. The other is Stephen Kotkin's definitive biography of Joseph Stalin, one of the world's most deadly tyrants. In addition to this scholarship, the project set an example of cooperation between once hostile nations. Despite cultural differences and logistical challenges spanning 3 continents, the desire to seek and deliver truth, however uncomfortable, successfully united both sides. The work undertaken by the Hoover Institution is as valuable as ever. Communism and its utopian promises continue to attract those who have never experienced its brutality, especially our youth. For those willing to learn, this collection of Soviet archives exposes communism for what it really is, a system that delivers only the opposite of what it promises. We at Hoover hope my book will be a source of inspiration to those who stand against threats to liberty and who support Hoover's continuing efforts to document and expose them for all to see.
The modern school reform movement began 40 years ago with the release of the landmark report, A Nation at Risk. This described a crisis in American education and made recommendations to improve student achievement. In the decades since, federal, state, and local leaders have pursued countless reforms aimed at boosting outcomes. But what actually worked? And what lessons can guide education policy today? The Hoover Education Success Initiative brought together 12 exceptional scholars to analyze the reform record of the last 40 years in our own report, which was called A Nation at Risk Plus 40. The goal was to document attempted changes in areas like standards, assessment, governance, and more, and then analyze the available evidence on each reform's impact. Taken together, the series gives an unprecedented view of reform efforts over time, revealing both bright spots and blind spots. The sheer volume of reforms pursued is striking. Billions of dollars were invested to adjust parts small and large across a mostly unchanged system. About half focused their improving efforts on inputs, like teacher quality or learning materials. These had limited effect unless implemented deeply and over time. Process reforms like accountability policies were harder to assess, but they showed promise when sustained and coherent. Output reforms directly targeting metrics like test scores did boost student learning initially. Graduation rates rose and achievement gaps narrowed, but many gains have reversed in recent years. Finally, outcome reforms set external quality bars for credentials and for student readiness. Though aspirations have grown, judging real progress requires applying uncompromising standards. A staggering array of treatments, interventions, redesigns, and innovations that our authors identified makes it a challenge to rationalize our collective experience into any semblance of order. Despite the cacophony, the catalog of activity amassed by our authors supports a few observations about our 40-year effort to reform that hold potential for illuminating future directions for elementary and secondary education in our country. First, most reforms were rushed out broadly without considering local fit or interactions with any other changes already underway. Second, the sheer volume of incremental, incoherent additions led to reform fatigue without meaningful improvement. Third, impatience for instant success ignored realistic timelines. Fourth, the system's resilience suggests reform attempts actually strengthened the status quo structures over time. And fifth, stagnant outcomes show a tolerance across the country for lackluster results. In effect, the report card on 40 years of education reform reads impulsive, incremental, incoherent, impatient, intransigent, and ineffective. This does not mean nothing worked. A few interventions, when implemented deeply, did improve student learning, but many more came and went, while the system's core remained untouched. Where does this leave policymakers seeking to help students emerge strong from our pandemic? Our research suggests a few guideposts. Ground education reforms in local context rather than imposing one-size-fits-all solutions. Commit to depth of implementation over breadth, and stay the course over years, not months. Align components into coherent strategies, engage synergies, not isolated efforts. Anchor designs in realistic timeframes and sustain support for the long haul. Study implementation and refine as needed. And uncompromisingly assess impact to ensure reforms deliver their intended benefits to students. American education faces no shortage of challenges. The one thing we may have conclusively proven is that the system, as presently constituted, has been resilient to reforms at scale. What is clear is that we have a thin collection of reforms that have been shown to work and that can scale. Instead, we have an impressive record of what not to do. We can't assume that ideas that have been proven effective in one setting will be effective in every setting. We can't expect changes at the margin, no matter how well they are done, to be able to leverage an entire school model. Our children deserve schools that enable them to achieve their full potential. If we learn from experience and hold fast to what works, better outcomes surely wait within reach. The time for thoughtful, sustained, and evidence-based improvement is now.
Remote work has exploded since the pandemic struck. Most employees like working from home at least some of the time. But this big shift in how we work and live is highly uneven across jobs and people. Frontline staff who earn modest paychecks rarely get to enjoy the benefits of working from home. Instead, they commute every workday to engage customers and coworkers, operate machinery, and look after facilities. In contrast, highly paid professionals and managers often work from home 2 or 3 days a week, saving time, money, and aggravation, and enjoying more personal autonomy and more time with family. That's the new work from home divide. In order to better track and understand this development, my co-authors and I built a large language model to read and classify job ads. We started by sampling 10,000 online job ads. We had real people read each one and flag the ads that say the job lets the employee work from home 1 or more days per week. Next, we used the results to train a language model to replicate the human readings. As it turns out, our language model replicates human judgments 99% of the time. Finally, we applied our language model to classify the work from home status of hundreds of millions of job ads over the past decade, and millions more ads each month. That yields monthly statistics on work from home opportunities by occupation, industry, city, and more. Let's look at how remote work opportunities vary with pay. Our data show that jobs with low pay, around $30,000 per year, very rarely offer the option to work remotely. As we move up the pay scale, work from home opportunities become more common. About 10% of new jobs that pay $60,000 per year offer remote work options. It's 20% for new jobs that pay $100,000, and more than 30% for new jobs that pay at least $200,000 per year. Not only that, the link between higher pay and remote work opportunities is much stronger today than before the pandemic. There's also a clear connection to education. Jobs requiring only a high school diploma very rarely provide remote work options. But nearly 30% of jobs that require a postgraduate degree allow for hybrid or fully remote work arrangements. Work from home opportunities also rise with experience levels. Only 3% of job ads that require less than 1 year of experience offer remote work. That makes sense because entry-level workers typically need more training, oversight, and mentoring. In contrast, more than 1/4 of jobs requiring 7+ years of experience offer work from home options. The more seasoned you are, the more likely that you can be effective when working remotely. Finally, there's a clear remote work divide between part-time and full-time employees. In light of these big differences in work from home opportunities, what should managers do? For starters, they should openly acknowledge that a divide exists so that employees feel heard. To avoid perceptions of unfairness, it helps to align the working arrangements of managers with those of the employees that they supervise. It's also worth considering options like a 4-day work week for staff that must work on site. Survey data reveal that many employees prefer to work 10 hours a day at 4 days a week rather than 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And managers should also consider one-time pay adjustments to compensate employees who miss out on the benefits of working from home. The data make it clear. The opportunity to work remotely differs greatly by type of job, pay level, education, and experience. This new divide will endure because remote work has proved practical and beneficial in many jobs and tasks. Since the remote work divide is here to stay, managers must grapple with the resulting tensions. If they don't, they may lose some of their best employees and experience a loss of morale and camaraderie among those who stay.
Election laws, from voter identification and felon disenfranchisement to automatic registration and no-excuse mail voting, are depicted by partisans in the media as having massive consequences on who votes and ultimately who wins elections. Many people express dismay about laws they disagree with, arguing the laws have dire consequences for American democracy. Some claim that laws allow voter fraud to swing elections in one way, while others claim that votes are suppressed to swing elections the other way. Listening to candidates, pundits, and partisans, it would be easy to conclude that election laws are ground zero for heated partisan battles, with the United States' status as a democracy at stake. But research I co-authored with my colleague Eitan Hirsch suggests that the heated rhetoric around election laws just doesn't match the evidence. In our study, we looked at the actual effects of policies like voter identification laws, election day registration, and early voting on election outcomes. We found these laws have negligible impacts on who wins elections. This may seem surprising given how fiercely the two parties fight over voting rules in legislative debates and court battles. Democrats often accuse Republican-backed policies like voter ID of suppressing turnout of Democratic voters. Republicans claim Democratic proposals like mail-in voting invite fraud that benefits the other side. Both parties imply the stakes are high whenever voting rules change. And yet, our research shows that partisan stakes are actually very low. That's because most voting laws only target a small fraction of voters, barely affect turnout rates, or tend to evenly target Democrats and Republicans. Take voter identification laws, which require voters to show approved photo identification at the polls. Critics charge these laws deter Democratic-leaning groups like minorities from voting. Yet studies have consistently found that voter identification laws tend to have no effect on overall turnout, and even a minuscule effect on turnout for individuals who lack identification. Because the laws have such a small effect on turnout, it just isn't possible that they could swing many votes to either party. And as a result, voter ID laws simply can't swing all but the very closest of elections. It's a similar story with other high-profile voting policies we analyzed. Expanding mail-in voting might raise turnout just slightly, but that increased turnout doesn't tend to benefit either party. Other laws have small effects that sometimes benefit Democrats and sometimes benefit Republicans. For example, we find that giving felons the right to vote benefits Democrats in some states and Republicans in others. We provide a mathematical framework to explain our results. Let me give you an example. In a state with an electorate split 51-49 Democrats to Republicans, let's suppose a new law is implemented that imposes additional requirements to vote. Let's also suppose that these new requirements only affect 4% of the electorate, and among this group, turnout drops 3 percentage points. And finally, let's suppose that those who are deterred from voting are disproportionately Democratic voters. So 60% of those deterred from voting are Democrats, while 40% are Republicans. What would happen to the outcome of the elections after implementing this law? Well, the policy would cause a 0.12 percentage point decline in overall turnout. That's barely an eighth of a percentage point. And the vote for the Democratic candidate would fall by 0.011 percentage points. In other words, if the state had 1 million eligible voters, the policy would deter 720 Democratic voters and 480 Republican voters, netting the Republicans a 240 vote shift. In reality, few voting laws even come close to depressing turnout among those targeted by even 1 percentage point, let alone 3 percentage points. And those laws rarely target just one party's base so precisely. Factoring in these realities, our study shows most voting rules barely make a dent in actual election results. This explains why academic studies like ours consistently find negligible partisan impacts from reforms like mail voting, voter ID, and same-day registration. Now, some claim parties and campaigns counter-mobilize against voting restrictions, masking their true effect. But my co-author and I show counter-mobilization is far too limited in scope to explain the null results found across dozens of studies. The bottom line from our research is clear. The partisan stakes of most voting laws are far lower than the overheated political rhetoric suggests. This doesn't mean election rules are unimportant, but it does explain why the partisan outcomes rarely match the doomsday prophecies of political parties and pundits. So next time you hear politicians or talking heads on TV insisting otherwise, remember the empirical evidence. Voting laws can raise valid concerns about equality, ethics, and implementation, but their partisan impacts are marginal. The data are clear, even when the rhetoric isn't.
In the United States, there are two major forms of retirement plans. First, defined contribution plans, and second, defined benefit plans. Most employees at private companies save for their retirement into a defined contribution plan, like a 401k plan, while the majority of state and local government employees, like teachers or policemen, have a defined benefit pension plan. For the latter, city and state governments guarantee the promised pension payment. Historically insufficient contribution and a volatile stock market created a large shortfall between the promised pension benefit and what those governments had saved for it. Under some measures, the total unfunded pension liability has reached over $6.5 trillion, or approximately 1/4 of the US GDP. This raises the question of whether there are other retirement plans available. Concretely, are there retirement plans that are both desirable from the employee perspective and financially sustainable for the employer? Along with my co-author Josh Rao, we surveyed over 7,600 public employees across 16 states to address this question. Specifically, we asked under what terms employees would switch to a defined contribution retirement plan, like a 401k plan. We found that 89% of them would accept the switch from their defined benefit pension plan to a defined contribution plan as long as their employer would contribute to their new retirement account. Overall, more senior employees said they would require larger employer contributions relative to younger workers. We also found that employees who perceived their pension plan's financial stability to be weak were more likely to accept a DC plan. In fact, for close to 80% of respondents, we find that the required contribution that employees demand is below the employer's service cost for the existing plan. That means that state and local governments could potentially save a lot of money by offering a DC retirement account. Separately from the financial aspect, defined contribution plans provide employees more flexibility. They allow people to relocate and change jobs more easily. More than that, they give employees the ability to, and they don't saddle state and local governments with large unfunded obligations far into the future. So why don't more employers offer their employees a choice? Economic and political constraints have often prevented the supply of a broader menu of retirement options. Employee representatives that negotiate the retirement terms are often the most senior and have a vested interest in maintaining the current plan. However, recent examples such as the state of North Dakota, the state of Kansas, and the city of Baltimore have shown that a transition to a defined contribution is possible if well designed. They either mandated a switch to a DC plan or provided new employees the option to choose between a DC or hybrid plan. As a result, they put their state or city onto a fiscally sound path. As the liability associated with defined benefit plans continue to grow, state and local governments are looking for alternatives to lower their future liabilities. Our survey demonstrates that there are alternative pension plans that are both desirable and fiscally sustainable. These options are particularly well received by young employees. Not only do these options preserve the satisfaction of employees with the expected retirement benefits, they also offer the ability to save taxpayers trillions of dollars.
If we want to protect all we hold dear at home and ensure America continues to be a force for good around the world, we must maintain a strong and unrivaled national defense. But achieving that in this century requires pivoting from how it was done last century. How we develop the technologies required to field a dominant military and how we enlist the support of our nation's most capable young people has drastically changed. In the Cold War, for example, the U.S. competed with the Soviet Union by building incrementally better large-scale defense platforms like aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and submarines. Leading defense platforms were largely developed in government labs or by major defense primes. Our best and brightest engineers coming out of Stanford or MIT went to work for government-affiliated labs and large defense companies to develop those platforms. It is a new world today. Many of the critical defense-relevant technologies like cyber, AI, additive manufacturing, and satellite imagery originate in the commercial sector. Critical advances in these technologies are not made by government directives, but by consumer demand. And our best and brightest engineers and programmers are incentivized to work for more lucrative options in startups or large companies like Google and Meta, not the DoD or other government agencies. In response to these new realities, we developed the Hacking for Defense program at Stanford in 2016, and more recently established the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. Our goals were twofold. First, to identify, adopt, and deploy solutions to critical defense challenges at speed and scale, and second, to create greater opportunities for students to get involved and perform meaningful public service short of joining the military or other government agencies. Undergraduate and graduate students with diverse backgrounds and interests, ranging from computer science and engineering to business, law, and social science, form 4 to 5 person teams to address a pressing defense or national security challenge. Teams are interviewed and selected based on the potential they demonstrate to address their chosen problem. Each team is assigned a sponsor from the military, defense, or other government agency to help them with their initial understanding of the problem and connect them with real-world stakeholders and beneficiaries. Teams are also paired with mentors from industry, Stanford's academic departments, and from Stanford's robust military fellows program at Hoover and FSI. The students employ lean problem-solving methods that require them to conduct at least 10 in-depth interviews with beneficiaries and other stakeholders each week as they test hypotheses, develop minimal viable products, and iteratively move towards deployable solutions. Many of our Hacking for Defense teams have gone on to form successful dual-use technology companies. For example, Capella Space is a synthetic aperture radar company on its way to a $1 billion valuation. It grew out of our first Hacking for Defense class in 2016 and currently provides critical imagery in support of operations in Ukraine. The problem-solving methodology for our Hacking for Defense class has been adapted to address other public sector challenges, leading to new classes taught here at Stanford, such as Hacking for Diplomacy and Hacking for Climate and Sustainability. Encouragingly, with support from partners like the nonprofit Common Mission Project, BMNT, and DoD's National Security Innovation Network, the Hacking for Defense and other Hacking For courses are now taught at over 60 universities across the United States, the UK, and Australia. Our experience with Hacking for Defense helped inspire the establishment of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation, or GKC, currently housed at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute. The center's mission is to solve the most pressing national security challenges at speed and scale and prepare future leaders to understand the implications of the intersection of commercial technologies and private capital with national security. We collaborate with the Management Science and Engineering Department at Stanford to develop new courses at the intersection of technology and national security. In the fall, for example, we teach Technology, Innovation, and Great Power Competition, which explores technological competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We've also established the Competitive Defense Innovation Scholars Program to provide even greater opportunities for our students and affiliates to employ their talent and intellect to help solve critical national security problems. Defense Innovation Scholars work across multiple quarters using the lean methodology on both policy convening technologists, investors, and other key players across the defense and substantive conversations. Ultimately, I am determined to ensure that the programs we offer, whether at the Hoover Institution or the Gordian Knot Center, empower students and the people we convene are national security resources that can be harnessed to help us prevail in the programs we offer, whether at the Hoover Institution or the Gordian Knot Center, empower students and the people we convene are national security resources that can be harnessed to help us prevail in the ongoing global competition to define the future world order. The stakes are too high not to bring these important resources to the fight.
The world is witnessing China's dramatic military buildup and growing economic presence. What's harder to see is how China is entering our minds and influencing our behaviors. I'm going to introduce you to the concept that China would like to dominate your mind, and consequently, your behavior. I'm being a little hyperbolic here, but only to make a point. The People's Republic of China and its Communist Party have invested heavily to develop global media systems and journalistic institutions in order to dominate news narratives and muddle previous and privileged perceptions. This determined plan intends in part to make people feel more positively towards China. It also wants to undermine criticism and change policies that aim to hold China accountable for the many unfair and aggressive actions it takes in trade, human rights, and against other nations. How does it do this? Let's take a look. Global mass media was dominated by the West in the pre-browser, pre-smartphone, pre-World Wide Web environment of the 20th century. In the new, technologically advanced 21st century, however, Western media institutions discovered that their free market, advertising-based business models collapsed. They were unable to adapt quickly enough. Simultaneously, in this new post-Cold War internet revolution world, global powers like Russia and a rising China found that they could suddenly compete in, and even dominate, the newly reforming information domain. While Western media institutions were shedding their foreign correspondents and closing their overseas bureaus, places like Xinhua, China Global Television Network, and China Daily were kicking into overdrive. The Chinese party state was spending extraordinary amounts to put as many so-called correspondents and bureaus in as many places as possible as quickly as they could. This was most pronounced in areas where Western correspondents had either retrenched or entirely disappeared. Latin America and Africa have been two ripe targets for this infusion of individuals and media infrastructure. China's media workers do not report and analyze the news to underpin and strengthen democracies. Instead, they're there to undermine Western institutions and governing structures. They feed these nations anti-American and anti-Western messaging and regularly accuse the West of being neo-colonialist. There is little to no credible Western counter to this persuasive propaganda. The kicker? Chinese media institutions are not only misinformation and disinformation channels, they are, in the West, call our journalists who gather information for the public reporters. My book, Spin Wars and Spy Games, made clear that both China and Russia use their reporters as information-gathering operatives to function as both witting and unwitting spies. The United States government came to some of these same conclusions when it recently required Chinese and Russian news organizations to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. An additional complicating factor is the role of social media platforms. From Facebook to YouTube to Twitter X, these American-based mass communications platforms have aided and abetted the distribution of our adversaries' misleading narratives and disinformation. Add to this the China-run and inordinately popular platform TikTok. Given TikTok's ability to micro-target its audiences with individualized, tailored propaganda, susceptibility to the threat from China becomes even greater. Much of how we behave and what we believe is shaped by our consumption of news, information, and data. As China and Russia continue to shape the global information environment and influence foreign electorates, authoritarian narratives and preferences will increasingly dominate our political discourse. What does this propaganda sound like? Here's how China put it recently. America's bullying tactics are incessant and diverse, but they all boil down to suppression, containment, and defamation. That attack on America sounds a little ham-handed, but China delivers this message daily and globally, both more subtly and via surrogates. The ongoing challenge to democratic open societies will be to continue providing a healthy, trustworthy, and unpolluted information environment. As a result, the battle for our hearts and minds is far from over, and we're slowly fighting back. Social media platforms have started to confront disinformation campaigns by clearly labeling Russian and Chinese media organizations as state-funded. Further, there are multiple academic, nonprofit, and government efforts to shore up local news organizations in the United States to provide citizens with credible and trusted information. Finally, an active, healthy, conscious understanding and awareness of foreign influence campaigns against the West is the most powerful step towards managing their effectiveness and countering their power.
Our healthcare system is wonderful in so many ways, but major problems remain. Millions are uninsured and costs keep rising. A big reason for this is that we as consumers of healthcare don't often know exactly how much our healthcare costs. Third parties like employers and the government are the ones who frequently negotiate and pay the bulk of healthcare bills. Why does it work like that in America? Well, one major culprit is our tax code, which gives workers a big tax break for health premiums paid through our employers. In many cases, we pay high premiums, get a nice tax break, and leave it to our employers and insurers to work out how much to pay the doctor or hospital where we received care. As a result, patients and providers don't have as much of an incentive to think about the costs of their day-to-day healthcare choices. Over the years, there have been efforts to fix the tax code's backward incentives. Around 30 million American families use health savings accounts, or HSAs, to save for their medical expenses. HSAs allow tax-free saving and spending on medical costs. But HSAs have strict limits on contributions and require insurance plans with high deductibles. New adoption of HSAs is slowing, and most Americans are not eligible to use them. To remedy that, policymakers should consider creating accounts that make it as easy to save for health expenses as it is to save for retirement. That's why we've proposed the creation of so-called individual health accounts, or IHAs. IHAs would be new universal savings accounts that offer more flexibility than HSAs. They would be available to anyone with health coverage, either from private or government-run plans. Contributions to these IHAs would be tax-deductible, and investments would grow tax-free. Withdrawals for medical expenses would be tax-free too. But unlike HSAs, which have fixed contribution limits, the amount you could put into your IHA would vary based on your insurance premiums. So if you pick a plan with lower monthly premiums, but higher out-of-pocket costs, you'd be able to contribute more to your IHA. But if you pick a plan with higher premiums and lower out-of-pocket costs, your contribution limits would be lower. Think of it like this. In 2023, the typical family and their employer will spend about $25,000 a year on health insurance. If they instead chose a plan that costs $20,000 a year, that family would be allowed to save $5,000 in their IHA. And those savings would help reduce their income tax liability too. If they end up needing that money to pay for out-of-pocket medical expenses, they can do so tax-free. If they want to spend the money on something else, they just have to pay the taxes on it. Pegging the maximum contribution amount to an IHA to the amount paid in health insurance premiums would give Americans an incentive to choose lower cost plans and become more price-conscious healthcare consumers, while still allowing families to choose the plan that works best for them. IHAs are designed to be flexible enough so that people with different kinds of coverage and from different walks of life can benefit. Americans who buy plans on individual markets, or with coverage subsidies created by Obamacare, or in-state Medicaid programs, could all potentially benefit from IHAs. Of course, IHAs won't solve all of our country's healthcare shortcomings, but they are a promising policy change that would lead us toward lower healthcare prices as well as better quality care, and ultimately put patients back in charge.
There is a broad consensus that something has gone terribly wrong at America's universities. Faculty report that they walk on eggshells in their classrooms. Invited speakers are heckled. Students denounce one another. Fearing one another, they keep their ideas to themselves. A necessary first step in fixing something that is broken is to diagnose the problem. Let us therefore start with the fundamentals. Universities play a crucial role in democratic societies. Their task is twofold: to conduct research that sorts out what is true from what is not, and to teach future generations the critical thinking skills necessary to perform this analysis on their own. There is an inherent tension baked into sorting out what is true from what is not. The reason is simple. When people disagree, it generates feelings of discomfort. That is especially the case when they realize that what they thought was true is shown to be false. Threats to the freedom to follow logic, reason, and evidence wherever it takes faculty or students historically tended to come from outside universities. Today, and for the last 20 years or so, threats to academic freedom have tended to come from inside universities. What has changed? The short answer is the growth of immense bureaucracies composed of non-faculty administrators. University bureaucrats are not in the business of sorting out what is true from what is not. They are in the business of growing their bureaucracies. It would not take lengthy argumentation to show that many university bureaucrats are also in the business of social engineering. The most generous interpretation of the motivation for social engineering by university bureaucrats is that they see their task as minimizing feelings of discomfort among students. To that end, university bureaucracies have redefined a word in common usage: harm. Harm in common usage has multiple meanings, such as material harm or bodily harm. But what all of those meanings have in common is that harm can be objectively established. Harm has now been redefined by university bureaucrats as feelings of discomfort, which means that it cannot be objectively established. It is a subjective state of mind. Their goal is to keep students safe from those feelings. The implications of this change are many, but first and foremost, it means that the goals of the bureaucrats, the duties of the faculty, and the aspirations of students are not aligned with one another. The bureaucrats, in fact, often come to see the faculty and the students as a problem that the bureaucracy has to fix. My team and I wanted to get a sense of how widespread these anti-intellectual social engineering initiatives are. So we did a study of the top 100 ranked colleges in the United States. If harm means feelings of discomfort, and discomfort can be caused by a written or spoken word, then the bureaucratic solution is to deem certain words harmful and purge them. 14 of the 100 colleges and universities we looked at have, or had, such lists of harmful words. Here's just a small selection of the harmful words in need of purging: American, immigrant, survivor, and man-made. If harm can be caused by ideas, even those that might be implicit in a comment by a professor or an offhand remark by another student, then the bureaucratic solution is to police comments or offhand remarks. University bureaucrats have therefore set up online bias reporting systems that allow students to report on one another, on staff, and on the faculty. These systems are Orwellian. They exist to make complaints about something that someone might have said. 84 of the 100 colleges we sampled have such bias reporting systems in place. Shockingly, among those 84, 82% allowed students to file reports on one another and on the faculty anonymously. The consequences of these assaults on academic freedom are still being played out. In the short term, faculty and students are the losers. In the long run, it's American society that will bear the brunt of the damage as free expression is suppressed and the ability to discern truth and falsehood withers amongst its citizens and policymakers. Academic freedom and freedom of expression are pillars of American society. Their survival is crucial to a flourishing democracy.
America emerged from World War II as the undisputed superpower. Its enemies were vanquished, its allies were hobbled, and its only rival, the Soviet Union, was reeling from the loss of 20 million citizens. But America's victory came at a moral cost. During the war, the U.S. committed extremely harsh, some would say cruel, acts against the innocent. It imprisoned thousands of American citizens solely on the basis of race. It used nuclear weapons against Japanese cities, killing approximately 200,000 civilians. And it imposed a punishing peace on Germany, exacerbating mass starvation. It's understandable that during war, hatred of the enemy would run pretty high. It's understandable and to be expected. And yet, exactly the opposite occurred. In my research, I found that the majority of Americans and most top officials favored mercy, not revenge. The most surprising aspect of these vengeful policies is just how little support they actually had. And after the war, the U.S. pursued tremendous humanitarian efforts, which for some may have been an act of atonement. Let me offer some examples. The war had shattered Europe's ability to produce and distribute food, and famine was threatening total collapse. And Germany was especially hard hit. That's because U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had shaped post-war occupation policy, which forbid American occupiers from helping the Germans to rebuild. This intensified the suffering of average Germans and hindered Europe's ability to recover. Germany was the economic engine that drove European growth. And as former President Herbert Hoover said, we can keep Germany in chains, but it will also keep Europe in rags. So Hoover had been blamed for the Great Depression, and he languished in political purgatory since his defeat in 1932. But after FDR died, President Truman brought Hoover back and named him the Food Ambassador, responsible for all global humanitarian relief efforts. Hoover had, of course, become famous internationally because of his famine relief work during and after World War I. And back then, the reporters used to say that Mr. Hoover knew where every bag of flour in the world was located. By 1946, it was clear that he still did. Hoover was appalled by the use of the atomic bombs. He was also very uneasy about the Japanese-American internment, although he never spoke out publicly against it. He was, however, adamantly opposed to the occupation policy, which was causing so much suffering for average Germans. In one speech, he told Americans, "We do not want our flag flying over a nation of Buchenwalds." Now in his 70s, Hoover traveled around the world, surveying exactly how much food was needed and where, and figuring out how to get it there. And when Hoover was asked directly whether America should really be feeding its former enemies, he was unequivocal. Starving people need our help. It doesn't matter who they are. Hoover inspired Americans to actually eat less and go hungry in order to free up more food for shipment overseas. It was becoming essential because by 1947, the famine situation was dire. Starvation seemed likely to cause societal collapse, heighten the spread of communism, and undo the hard-won peace. But then, an American columnist, Drew Pearson, had an idea. He suggested a friendship train that would speed across the country, gathering food donations from average Americans. And amazingly, even after years of wartime rationing, Americans were still eager to give. Now, part of this did seem to have a performative dimension. People seemed desperate to show the world just how good they really were. Many recognized the cruelty that their country had committed during the war, and they wanted to say, this is not who we are. Whatever their motives, the fact is that American humanitarian relief saved millions from malnutrition, starvation, and death. It was one of the greatest humanitarian efforts in history, and it happened in part because of compassionate leaders, a humane public, and the willingness to sacrifice for strangers overseas, even the country's former foes. I tell my students that when a country treats others with dignity, decency, and a deep sense of fairness, it not only enhances its own power, it helps to build a better world. We all know that America has often failed to live up to its ideals, but those ideals remain its greatest source of strength.
Computer modeling is central to climate science. Climate models help us understand how the climate system works, why it has changed in the past, and most importantly, how it might change in the future. But we have to keep in mind that usefully describing the Earth's climate is one of the most challenging scientific simulation problems. So, how good are our climate models? And how much confidence should we have in what they say about future climates? To answer that, let's talk about how the models work. All but the simplest climate models begin by covering the Earth's atmosphere with a three-dimensional grid, typically 10 to 20 layers of grid boxes stacked above a surface grid of 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. Grids covering the ocean usually have a smaller grid squares, closer to 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. With the grids in place, the computer models use the fundamental laws of physics to calculate how the air, water, and energy in each box at a given time move to neighboring grid boxes at a slightly later time. This process is then repeated over and over. It all sounds straightforward, but it's not at all easy. In fact, it's excruciatingly difficult, and anyone who says that climate models are just physics either doesn't understand them or is being deliberately misleading. One major challenge is that the models use only single values of temperature, humidity, and other variables to describe conditions within the entire grid box. For example, they ignore the temperature difference between Palo Alto and Stockton, which are 100 kilometers apart. Another is that models have to be initialized, but even with our most sophisticated observation systems, getting the right starting points in each grid box is really difficult. Considerable judgment is required by the modelers, and since different modelers make different assumptions, results can vary widely. Next comes tuning, which is the process of adjusting the model to deal with troublesome inconsistencies or irksome uncertainties. Sometimes modelers are tuning parameters in ways that aren't based on their knowledge of the parameter, but rather are aimed at producing a desired result. The documentation for one model tells of tuning a parameter related to convection in the atmosphere by a factor of 10, because the originally chosen value resulted in twice as much warming as had been observed. You'd think, based on popular reports, that all models arrive at nearly the same answer. But that's not true either. If you delve deeper into the IPCC models, you'll find that the results presented are averages of models that disagree often wildly with one another. One particularly jarring failure is that the simulated global average surface temperature, not its changes, varies among models by about 3 degrees Celsius, which is 3 times greater than the observed 20th century warming that they're attempting to describe and explain. And incredibly, as the models have gotten more sophisticated with finer grids and more subgrid parameterizations, the uncertainty has increased rather than decreased. Historical analyses of the same models also don't inspire confidence. An analysis of hundreds of simulations run by the latest models used by the IPCC shows that they do a very poor job of describing the warming over the past century. That models can't reproduce the past is a big red flag. It erodes confidence in their projections of future climates. It's uncommon for the popular media to discuss how problematic our climate models are. Those uncertainties should make us skeptical of their ability to predict human-caused consequences in the climate. I believe a fairer assessment would be something like the uncertainties in modeling of both climate change and the consequences of future greenhouse gas emissions make it impossible today to provide reliable, quantitative statements about relative risks, consequences, and benefits of rising greenhouse gases to the Earth system as a whole, let alone to specific regions of the planet. As the reports themselves often note, the models are the best we've got, and they are getting more sophisticated. But for now, they're beset with myriad problems, and I wish they were better.
Silicon Valley Bank's failure began several of the largest bank failures in American history, leading the federal government to step in to prevent widespread contagion. Thousands of banks are still in trouble, but there is a more cost-effective way to solve the banking crisis that doesn't require trillions of dollars from the government. Silicon Valley Bank and others failed because they invested a large number of assets in long-term, low-interest bonds and loans and did not protect themselves from the risk of higher interest rates. They were also financed in large part by uninsured, flighty depositor. As a result, when interest rates rose over the last year, as the Fed tightened monetary policy, the value of their assets fell and their flighty depositors ran to withdraw their funds. Research that my colleagues and I did during the weekend of SVB's failure suggests that when the assets that all US banks hold are measured on a mark-to-market basis based on interest rates today, that is, not based on the value at maturity, but at current prices if the assets were sold today, balance sheets of American banks are $2 trillion lower than their current book values. This is a large number, especially if you compare it with the $2 trillion aggregate equity in the US banking system as of March 2023. A full accounting of these losses has been avoided by banks' ability to maintain held-to-maturity assets at their book value. That is, these losses are unrealized for now. But there's no avoiding the economic reality that the true value of equity capital in the banking industry has fallen by at least this amount. This is a problem. These reductions in asset values are unequally distributed across the system, with some banks being particularly hard hit. In a well-capitalized banking system, the distribution of equity to asset ratio you would want to see across 4,800 banks in the US banking system would be above zero. But our analysis suggests that the entire distribution shifts to the left when accounting for mark-to-market valuations. In other words, over 2,000 banks, accounting for $11 trillion of assets in aggregate, fall below the 0% line. The important implication of this analysis is that the recent fragility and collapse of several high-profile banks is not an isolated phenomenon. Nearly half of the US banks could face similar difficulties if forced to liquidate a significant fraction of their assets in the wake of large deposit withdrawals. Now, how can government avoid the calamitous path taken all too often of regulatory forbearance, as in the US saving and loans crisis, the Japanese banking crisis, and the European debt crisis? Economic solvency requires a market test. The ability to raise new equity or long-term unsecured debt from outside investors is one such test that draws a clean line between solvent but illiquid and insolvent. Solvent banks with franchise value would be able to attract such capital. In addition, new capital inflows would reduce fragility and restore skin in the game for these institutions. There are two options for making sure more solvent but illiquid banks don't fail. The traditional regulatory lever is to raise capital requirements, that is, to require banks to have more cash on hand available for depositors to withdraw. But that's not a good prescription for solvent banks that are currently stressed. It would result in solvent banks contracting their lending. The course of action we recommend is instead for the government to require raising capital via equity. The amount per bank would be assessed by regulators on a bank-by-bank basis. In other words, banks would shore up their balance sheets by selling public shares or some other form of equity to increase their cash on hand. To avoid the stigma of an equity raise, it would have to be required across many banks. In the immediate term, regulators could also help banks increase their equity buffer by restricting equity payouts and tie continued access to government lending facilities to increase equity raises. Something must be done. Banks are too fragile in today's interest rate environment, and there's likely to be turbulence in the commercial real estate market soon, as businesses continue to deal with permanent work from home phenomena. Regulators have a really tough job ahead of them, providing insolvent banks a lifeline which sow the seeds of a crisis in the future that would have banks gambling for resurrection, similar to savings and loan crisis of 1980s. Our proposal asks regulators to rely on the market to determine which banks are truly insolvent. Requiring banks to raise equity capital now will be less disruptive to the economy than having a large number of small and medium-sized insolvent banks drain taxpayer resources and eventually fail.
Teachers' unions have a major impact on local school board elections in the United States. They win 7 out of every 10 races when they make an endorsement, and union support makes the difference for both incumbents and challengers. Contrary to some expectations, the Supreme Court's 2018 Janus decision failed to reduce union power and influence in local school politics. A full decade after the court prohibited unions from charging fees to non-union teachers, union-backed candidates remain the ones to beat. As part of different research projects over a period of several years, I collected data on nearly 5,000 union endorsements in school board elections. These endorsements were gathered for 3 of the nation's 4 largest states, California, Florida, and New York. Union win rates were 64% in Florida, 71% in California, and 80% in New York. On the whole, union electioneering is successful in liberal, moderate, and conservative districts. According to my data, union-backed candidates never won less than 60% of their elections, even in the most GOP-leaning districts. The consequences of union power in local school board elections are significant. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, schools remained closed for in-person learning much longer in communities where unions were more active and influential in local school board elections. And just as many experts predicted, student learning suffered more in these same communities. For parents' rights groups, education reformers, and school choice advocates wishing to counteract union dominance in local school politics, there are important lessons to be learned. These groups cannot simply rely on favorable partisan tides in national politics or narrow legal decisions that weaken unions to advance their cause. After all, school board elections are fought and won in the trenches at the local level. But my research did uncover one exception to union dominance in school board elections. That exception was something of a natural experiment that took place in Florida's 2022 primary contest, the de facto general election for school board races with just 2 candidates. Although Florida's school board elections are nonpartisan, something unprecedented happened. Governor Ron DeSantis and the Republican Party of Florida put school board elections on their agenda. During the summer leading up to the August primary election, Governor DeSantis unveiled a 10-point education agenda and asked local school board candidates to pledge their support. After candidates decided whether to align with the governor's conservative education agenda, DeSantis chose 30 candidates and offered them his official endorsement and financial support. In certain hotly contested races, DeSantis even campaigned locally on behalf of the candidates. The move was unprecedented. This is new, particularly for Republicans, DeSantis told the news service of Florida, because traditionally, unions would back candidates, and that would be it. DeSantis' move worked on a scale unlike anything seen before. In the 19 elections where one of the governor's candidates went head-to-head with a teachers' union-backed opponent, the unions won just 4 races and advanced to a general election runoff in just 3. In previous elections, where voters did not have the same cues to follow, teachers' unions won over 70% of the time when they made an endorsement. In contrast, Florida's teachers' unions only won 20% of the elections where DeSantis offered voters a conservative alternative in 2022. The key advantage of the DeSantis strategy is that it requires no electoral reforms. Moreover, the DeSantis approach is available to both Democratic and Republican governors who believe that their education agendas are sufficiently popular with voters to provide coattails to local school board candidates who buy in. Although some election law scholars have made a good case for adopting electoral reforms that would allow political executives like mayors or governors to make on-ballot endorsements, DeSantis proved that even absent these formal legal changes, a recognizable political figure with a clearly articulated education policy agenda can make races more competitive by endorsing aligned school board candidates and campaigning on their behalf. Teachers' unions retain many advantages that will continue to allow them to be key players in local school politics. And while that dynamic is unlikely to change anytime soon, there appears to be a reasonable blueprint for advocates of more balance in local school politics on which to build.
War games are having a moment. Newspaper and nightly news warn that war games map a huge toll in a war over Taiwan, and that in order to win, the Air Force will have to buy new bombers and fighters. Congress members like Congressman Mike Gallagher have even argued that war games should be a standard part of congressional budget and legislative processes. So what are war games? And should we believe what they say? While often called simulations or exercises, war games are distinct from computer simulations of combat, field exercises featuring actual military forces, or organized brainstorming sessions, affectionately called BOGSATs. Instead, war games are interactive events that display 4 characteristics: human players, immersed in scenarios, bounded by rules, and motivated by consequence-based outcomes. War games go back millennia, with evidence of games in ancient Rome, early Iraq, and China. They took on a central role in the modern conduct of war with the Prussian development of Kriegspiel, a board game that simulated combat to train officers. A century later, the United States' embrace of war games for military planning between World Wars I and II became a pivotal part of the Navy's success in the Pacific. During the Cold War, the U.S. military turned again to war games to understand the impact of the nuclear revolution. U.S. defense wargaming continued after the Berlin Wall fell, with games designed to test new ideas about warfare and aid acquisition decisions. But while wargames have primarily looked at military or crisis situations, their use goes far beyond war. Governments use games to simulate natural disasters and to assess economic cooperation. Consultants use wargaming to test new business strategies, and scholars use gaming to study how human behavior affects various social and political phenomena like governance, revolutions, and insurgencies. Games are closely tied to policy decisions. Because they have such a strong experiential quality, they can be compelling evidence for policymakers faced with difficult decisions in rare or unexpected scenarios. Senior decision makers often rely on lessons learned from games in which they previously participated, and the evocative results from games, especially ones played with high realism, can be far more persuasive than lab-produced models or simulations. Indeed, games can be such powerful devices of influence that organizations have been known to change rules, to influence outcomes, and leak results when it benefits their cause. War games are increasingly prevalent and have a long history of influencing policy. But what makes a good game? And how should we evaluate wargaming data when making policy? In general, for games that are analytic or designed to answer questions, a good game should have 5 qualities. First, they need to be enjoyable and believable so that players act in the game as they would in real life. This is what we call external validity in social science. Secondly, they need the right players with the correct expertise and demographics to mirror real-world decision makers. In other words, we need the right sample to represent our real-life population. Third, there need to be enough players and game iterations to be able to make conclusions that go beyond the unique characteristics of any one instance. This is called generalizability. Fourth, good war games control for bias within their scenarios and rules. Things like baking in certain outcomes or creating scenarios that unduly influence players' behaviors. When we're able to control for bias that may invalidate results, we call this internal validity. The best games have both external and internal validity. Finally, for analytical games, the best designs have good data collection, able to explain not only what happened in the game, but why. The primary value of using and analyzing war games is not in generating new or better data about outcomes, but is instead in understanding behaviors and choices leading to these outcomes. War games don't predict what will happen in conflict or crisis, but they can tell us why and how one outcome or another occurred. This can be hard to do, and so most games struggle on one of these dimensions, sometimes intentionally. That doesn't mean that war games aren't important for policy, but that we need to do a better job of analyzing across games for patterns of outcomes and behaviors. Here at the Hoover Institution, we are working to make wargaming an even better tool for policymakers, building the first ever open source archive of war games and wargaming data, running games on some of the biggest policy questions of our time about cyber, nuclear weapons, AI and space, and providing wargaming resources for the classroom to build the next generation of policy analysts.
What does a fair tax code look like? That's a more difficult question to answer than you might think, because it requires balancing trade-offs between efficiency and equity. It's relatively easy for economists to measure the efficiency of the tax code, but the debate gets complicated when it comes to fairness. That's because fairness is a subjective concept, making it difficult to determine without a specific social welfare function. In other words, there isn't a clear maximization formula for fairness that everyone agrees upon. For example, many people believe that Nordic countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Finland have a fairer tax system that provides a more comprehensive social safety net and more public services. However, the differences between the Nordic and US tax systems at the top are not that large, with one notable exception. The average Nordic top marginal tax rate kicks in at 1.4 times the average wage in the country, while in the US it kicks in at 8.5 times the average wage. In practice, this means the average personal income tax rate for a typical one-earner married couple with 2 children in the Nordic countries, including cash transfers, was 21.7%. In contrast, that same family in the United States paid just 11.9% in 2019, and it was 1% in 2021 due to a temporary expansion of the child tax credit. Additionally, the average sales or value-added tax in the Nordic countries is 24.6%, while it's only 6% in the United States. Is the Nordic tax system more fair? There's no definitive answer to this question. While the Nordic system provides more benefits, such as socialized healthcare, it also requires lower and middle-class families to pay higher taxes to finance these benefits. If the US were to finance Nordic-style social programs with Nordic-style taxes, the top marginal tax rate would need to kick in at a much lower income level, around $88,000 instead of $535,000 like it does now. And sales tax rates would have to increase significantly. The real question to ask in this debate is, what is the trade-off between fairness and efficiency that is being optimized for? When a tax cut benefits everyone, including the wealthy, why is it considered unfair? For instance, in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced the tax rate on corporate income, leading to opposition and criticism from the academic community because of its perceived unfairness. And yet it resulted in higher gains in both income and wealth for the bottom of the income and wealth distributions than it did for the top. This confusion surrounding the social welfare maximization debate may stem from a lack of distinction between the statutory incidence and the economic incidence of a tax. Statutory incidence determines who legally pays the tax, while economic incidence shows who actually bears the ultimate burden of the tax. For example, when a corporation experiences a tax increase, the burden of the tax often falls on lower skilled workers, even though the tax was imposed on the corporation. A recent academic study found that workers bear about half of the total burden of corporate income taxation. Therefore, it's important to understand that just because a tax is increased against a well-off group does not necessarily mean that it benefits the less well-off. Similarly, just because a tax might benefit those who are well-off doesn't necessarily mean that it comes at the expense of the less well-off. When discussing tax fairness, it is crucial to understand the trade-off between fairness and efficiency. The use of relative terms like fairness muddies the discourse on taxes, leading people to reject absolutely efficient gains that they perceive as unfair, even though they may make everyone better off.
The world is mired in a deep, diffuse, and protracted democratic recession. What was true during the 20th century is even truer today. Every political system is affected by every other, and powerful, aggressive autocracies pose an existential and expansive threat to the world's democracies. Strong U.S. leadership is crucial to support global democracy. But that leadership must be continually emphasized to each new generation. A world filled by democracies and the rule of law is more peaceful, secure, and prosperous, as democracies are less likely to pose a threat and more likely to ensure global peace and prosperity. The hard truth is that the world's two major autocracies, China and Russia, are waging sophisticated and well-resourced global campaigns to discredit and subvert democracy. And in this new century, the United States and its allies have been ill-prepared to fight back. A narrative has been taking hold that democracies are corrupt and worn out, that they lack energy, capacity, and self-confidence. And the developing world is listening, with many people now looking to Beijing for partnership and inspiration. After a decade and a half of losing ground, democracy promotion needs to be reset. The guiding principle for the right strategy is simple. Power matters. This is not to endorse using force to impose democracy. That approach almost always fails, and it discredits peaceful efforts. But as the political scientist Samuel Huntington noted, military and diplomatic power create the geopolitical context in which democracy thrives or founders. Preserving U.S. military strength and the vigor and deterrent capabilities of U.S. alliances and partnerships is vital to keeping democracy secure against authoritarian encroachment and intimidation. Critics question whether the U.S. should avoid beginning a new Cold War, but the U.S. needs to defend the principles of freedom and territorial integrity, or the coming years will be more like the 1930s than the 1990s. To avoid this reality, there is no more important priority than ensuring that Russia's brutal war against Ukraine's democracy ends in Moscow's defeat. Victory is not just imperative to protect the Ukrainians' right to self-governance. If Ukraine emerges from this conflict substantially free and secure, with its pre-war territory intact, and with aid and investment flowing in to rebuild, several powerful lessons will become clear. Bystanders will realize that democracy is not a weak system. Just as it did for the United Kingdom in World War II, the world will also see that the United States and its allies will sacrifice to help an embattled democracy defend itself, and to reaffirm the most vital principle of the international order, that territorial aggression will not stand. It will also demonstrate the disastrous incompetence and miscalculation of Putin's authoritarian state, and remind the world that when leaders are not constrained by checks and balances and by alternative flows of information, they are prone to ruinous blunders. There is another reason why failure is not an option in Ukraine: Taiwan. China appears increasingly determined to reunify Taiwan with the mainland for symbolic, political, economic, and strategic reasons. Symbolically, the Chinese Communist Party's rulers claim that annexing Taiwan would end a long humiliation and restore China's rightful status as the dominant power in Asia. Politically, the Chinese leadership's absorption of Taiwan would extinguish the living proof that a Chinese society can govern itself as a liberal democracy. If Taiwan eventually falls, or the conquest looks inevitable, other countries will opt to ride the wave of China's hegemonic ascent rather than be drowned by it. For this reason, preserving Taiwan's autonomy as a thriving democracy is an overriding strategic priority, not just for the region, but for the entire world. A world in which democracy and the rule of law predominate will be a much more peaceful and economically secure world. The United States needs to politically and financially support the people struggling at great risk for freedom. This is a moral imperative, and it is in the United States' national interest to encourage transitions to more democratic, lawful, and accountable governments around the world.
Speaker Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan precipitated the largest set of Chinese military exercises in the Taiwan Strait in the last 20 years. China's recent actions, along with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have led many Americans to reconsider their stance on military support for foreign conflicts. Should America remain involved with Taiwan? And should we defend it if China were to invade? Our overriding objective is peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. To that end, the United States does not support unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. We oppose any actions by China to invade, blockade, or otherwise impose unification by force. But we also oppose a unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan. Until recently, Beijing pursued a two-track strategy of trying to win over Taiwanese public support for unification through closer economic and people-to-people ties, while at the same time building up a military deterrent to prevent unilateral declaration of independence. But under Xi Jinping's leadership, Beijing appears, perhaps, to have shifted goals from deterring independence to compelling unification within a finite period of time. The Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping views Taiwan as an existential issue. It is committed to eventual unification, and with Xi Jinping beginning his third term as leader of the country and the party, he may view Taiwan as a legacy issue that has to be resolved before he leaves power. How do the Taiwanese feel about unification? Well, public support on the island is very, very low. Support for unification now or at some point in the future used to be high as 20%. But with the PRC's recent failed efforts to influence Taiwan's elections and the military drills that have been held around the island, that support has fallen down to around 6%. As Beijing appears to be moving up its timetable for taking control of Taiwan, it is reasonable to ask, should the United States remain committed to Taiwan's defense? And if so, how? Well, there are at least 4 reasons why the United States should remain committed to Taiwan's defense. First, Taiwan is a long-time ally of the United States, and it is our 10th largest trading partner. To put that in some perspective, Ukraine last year was 67th. Taiwan is also a major supplier of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips, and we saw the negative economic impacts of supply chain disruption during COVID, when even relatively minor shortages of chips occurred. The consequences of China seizing, destroying, or blockading Taiwanese exports, those consequences would be enormous for the global economy and for Taiwan's people and the people of the United States. Second, there is Taiwan's strategic geographic location in the first island chain. For 70 years, the U.S. has had an interest in ensuring that a friendly government controls the territory of Taiwan and that the People's Liberation Army cannot use it as a base to project power out into the Western Pacific. Third, Taiwan is a powerful symbol of the U.S.'s enduring commitment to the free and liberal world. Taiwan is not an Afghanistan or an Iraq. It is already a liberal democracy. And in per capita income terms, it is equal to Germany and even richer than Japan today. American support is directly responsible for that prosperity. It is a shining example of how being part of the U.S.-led liberal capitalist world order can increase freedom and prosperity for everyone. Finally, a thriving Taiwan is proof that democracy is not incompatible with Chinese culture or values. The biggest prize of all for the U.S. would be to have China follow Taiwan's lead and to transition to a market economy and a liberal democracy. Abandoning Taiwan to the authoritarian Communist People's Republic of China across the Taiwan Strait would mean walking away from a 72-year commitment. It would weaken or destroy the credibility of American alliances with Japan, with the Philippines, and with South Korea, and to other countries in the world facing pressure from authoritarian governments. Defending Taiwan is not an impossible task. The military threat from the PRC has steadily increased over the past 2 decades, but with the right strategy, it remains feasible for Taiwan and the United States together to deter military aggression and to maintain peace and stability across the strait. The CCP's insistence that it will pay any price and bear any burden to achieve unification is remarkably self-serving, and it is intended to persuade the U.S. and partners and allies simply to walk away from Taiwan without a fight. But in reality, China does not need Taiwan. It has survived and prospered for 70 years without exercising political control. And there is no reason why Beijing must seek to conquer Taiwan today.
It has gone unnoticed that the largest economic cost of the COVID-19 pandemic will come from shortfalls in student learning from school closures and the general disruption of normal schooling. The best estimates place learning losses at the equivalent of a year or more of schooling. For the average student, their total lifetime earnings will fall by 6%. For disadvantaged students, the effects will be even larger. Schools are now struggling to restore the schools that we had in March of 2020. But the learning losses will be permanent if we just return to those levels. Offsetting the pandemic requires improving the schools. Over the years, researchers have found extraordinarily consistent results about the relationship between teacher effectiveness and student achievement. A study I conducted in the public schools of Gary, Indiana in the early 1990s found that the best teachers provided a year and a half of academic growth for students in each school year, while the least effective only provided a half year's learning. Other researchers have reached similar conclusions in Los Angeles, New York, Tennessee, Texas, and elsewhere. How then to deal with the profound learning losses that have occurred during the pandemic? Unfortunately, improving individual teacher performance remains quite challenging. A more potent solution is to keep and reward the most effective teachers while getting rid of the least effective ones. This prescription is energetically resisted by the teachers' unions, who argue that such policies promote favoritism, drive out teachers even as we face shortages, and distract from the need to improve salaries and benefits across the board. But reforms focused on teacher effectiveness have been implemented in several places, and the results show a clear path to improving schools. In 2009, the school chancellor and mayor in Washington, D.C. were able to implement a system called Impact that evaluated the district's teachers. Based on these assessments, the most effective teachers were highly rewarded with annual bonuses and increases in base salaries of up to $25,000. The least effective were asked to leave. In the first 3 years of Impact, almost 4% of teachers were dismissed for poor performance, and an even larger percentage, under threat of dismissal, voluntarily left. At the same time, retention rates for the most effective teachers increased significantly. Since the introduction of Impact more than a decade ago, the test scores of Washington students, at least before the pandemic, rose faster and more consistently than those in any other large city district with significant disadvantaged populations. Another instructive case is the Dallas Independent School District, where the former superintendent implemented a new evaluation and pay system for teachers and principals starting in 2014. A key part of the Dallas system is to send the best teachers where they're needed the most. In 2016, teachers at the top 3 rating levels got bonuses of $8,000 to $12,000 to move to the schools with the lowest student performance. Within 3 years, those schools got close to the Dallas average, and student performance in Dallas as a whole improved relative to other large districts in Texas. Reforms focused on teacher effectiveness may stand a better chance today than before the pandemic. Educators and public officials understand the urgency of improvement if we are not going to abandon the COVID cohort of students. The past few years also have given parents a closer look at the instruction that their children receive, and many have come away disappointed and determined to push for change. To rescue today's COVID cohort of students, there's no need to wait for further retirements or a new crop of entry-level teachers. A focus on more effective teachers could be implemented quickly by providing salary incentives to effective teachers to take on more students. The window for addressing the profound learning deficit created by the pandemic will close before long. That would leave millions of students at a lifelong disadvantage, unless we can give them access to the most capable teachers.
The Taliban's rapid takeover of Afghanistan last summer raised fears that the country would once again become a safe haven for Islamist militants intent on international terrorism. And to a large extent, those fears are justified. Al-Qaeda, of course, between 1996 and 2001 was hosted by the Taliban in Afghanistan, and it was there that it plotted its signature terrorist attacks, including the attacks of 9/11. Today, however, the situation is more complex. Al-Qaeda now has a major jihadi competitor in the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, and both of these groups face obstacles in their quest to use Afghanistan as a platform for their international agendas. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are bitterly divided over what role a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan will play in the global jihadi landscape. Al-Qaeda presents itself as the more moderate of these groups and has sought to remain close to the Taliban. For Al-Qaeda, the Taliban's victory is presented as an epic triumph, the fulfillment of God's promise to give victory to the believers over the unbelievers. The outcome in Afghanistan, according to Al-Qaeda, proved that, quote, the path of jihad, not compromise or conciliation, was the right way to deal with infidel states. But for ISIS, the idea that the Taliban have achieved any kind of victory in Afghanistan is laughable. What really happened, in their view, was that the United States willingly handed power to the Taliban, who have effectively become a U.S. client. So for ISIS, this was not a triumph at all, but rather evidence of the Taliban's willingness to collaborate with the Americans. In the view of ISIS, the Taliban is in fact an infidel apostate group that has strayed from its roots and must be fought. And indeed, that is what ISIS in Afghanistan has been doing since the U.S. departure, conducting terrorist attacks on Taliban targets and certain civilian populations. So where does the Taliban fit into all of this? Clearly, the Taliban are not aligned with ISIS. The enmity between these groups is genuine and will persist. But what about Al-Qaeda? Does the Taliban seek to promote Al-Qaeda and its agenda of international terrorism? The answer here seems to be both yes and no. In its February 2020 deal with the United States, the Taliban pledged not to allow any group, including Al-Qaeda, to use Afghanistan as a base to attack the United States and its allies. And recently, the Department of State assessed that the Taliban have taken steps to meet that commitment, though the military, at the same time, predicts that the Taliban will likely loosen its restrictions on Al-Qaeda in the coming years. The way then I think one has to look at this is that the Taliban want to have it both ways. They want to secure international recognition as the legitimate rulers of Afghanistan, and they want to maintain their relationship with Al-Qaeda. In part, this is because some factions of the Taliban are more closely aligned, even intermarried with Al-Qaeda than others. Despite their relationship, the Taliban also have a strong interest in holding Al-Qaeda in check. Particularly as they pursue international recognition and acceptance, it would be folly for the group to permit Al-Qaeda to launch attacks on the West or even on fellow Muslim states. It is not hard to imagine a scenario, therefore, in which the Taliban provides space and financial support for Al-Qaeda to operate, while also prohibiting them from launching offensive operations. The Taliban's second attempt at governing Afghanistan thus involves a balancing act between adhering to their hardline principles and making pragmatic concessions to secure their rule. ISIS, meanwhile, will continue to operate by attacking the Taliban and civilians to try to destabilize the Taliban's rule. ISIS in Afghanistan is much larger than Al-Qaeda. It has some 2,000 militants compared to Al-Qaeda's less than 200. And ISIS will probably benefit from the reduced military pressure in Afghanistan that comes from the U.S. absence. However, for reasons to do with both geography and the version of Islam that it represents, ISIS has only limited appeal in the country. None of this is to minimize the threat that these jihadi groups pose to Afghanistan, to its neighbors, and to the world. The United States and its allies must remain vigilant and proactive, lest one or both of these groups re-emerge in force. And while ISIS certainly has the upper hand at the moment, exactly how successful the jihadis might be in utilizing Afghanistan remains to be seen.
It's no secret that American society is bitterly divided, with Americans deeply distrustful of those with different political beliefs. It often feels like we're living in different realities, talking past each other and unable to agree on even the most basic facts. In September 2019, we ran an experiment to see if something could be done to heal our political divides and reduce animosity. The experiment was called America in One Room, and it brought together 523 Americans to a conference center in Dallas, Texas. These Americans were selected randomly and were demographically and politically representative of all registered voters. A representative control group of 844 Americans was also randomly selected, but did not go to Dallas. The participants were given briefing materials with expert opinions from both the left and the right on the pros and cons of major policies in immigration, healthcare, taxes, the environment, and foreign policy. Participants were then randomly assigned to groups of 10 to 12 people and, with a moderator, engaged in face-to-face discussions on the policy issues. The deliberations spanned 3 days. The objective for each group was not to come to a consensus or to change anyone's mind. It was simply to deliberate on the merits of various policy proposals by listening and sharing opinions. Could this kind of deliberation lead ordinary citizens to re-examine their thinking? Could it humanize the so-called other side and help people understand other perspectives? To answer these questions, we surveyed the participants and the control group just before and just after the deliberations, as well as a year later, right before the 2020 general election. Our findings were striking. While the control group, as expected, saw basically no change in its positions over the 3 days of deliberation, the participants did. The most polarizing proposals, whether from the left or the right, generally lost support, and a number of more centrist proposals moved to the foreground. Crucially, proposals that were farther on the right typically lost support from Republicans, and proposals that were farther on the left lost support from Democrats. As an example, support among Republicans for reducing the number of refugees allowed to resettle in the U.S. dropped from 66% to 34%, while support among Democrats for a $15 minimum wage fell from 83% to 59%. Republican support for using taxes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions went up from 33% to 44%, while Democratic support for the Trans-Pacific Partnership grew from 66% to 88%. What's more, Republicans and Democrats reported more positive feelings towards members of the opposite party after the experiment. Among Republicans with the most strongly held policy beliefs, attitudes towards Democrats improved from a 5 on a 100-point scale to 29. For Democrats with the most strongly held policy beliefs, attitudes towards Republicans improved from 8 to 24. These short-run results were encouraging, but did they stick? When we ran surveys a year later, in the midst of a heated presidential campaign and the grief and isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic, the answer we found was complicated. A year later, our participants had for the most part reverted back in their policy views and in their feelings towards those of the opposite party. But one result stood out. Participants who had little interest or knowledge of politics and policy were, a year later, more civically engaged than comparable individuals in the control group. By giving them a space to engage in respectful and reasoned political dialogue, to be heard without being drowned out by forcefully held beliefs, we enabled previously disengaged Americans to become more civically engaged. A year later, they were more likely to feel that their political views are worth listening to, more likely to know who controls the House and the Senate, and more likely to vote. More research is underway right now to see if experiments like America in One Room can be scaled up, perhaps online, and even with an AI moderator. What if people had the opportunity to deliberate on policy issues with different people more regularly, to debate and disagree without being disagreeable? Our work suggests that such experiences can help reduce political animosity and encourage greater civic engagement.
Is Russia inherently imperialist and expansionist? Must Russia, by some innate cultural or civilizational trait, seek to conquer its neighbors? No. Russian aggression is not innate, it is a choice, and Russia's rulers could make different choices. Russian aggression stems from what I call Russia's geopolitical conundrum. Russians, especially elites in Russia, have long harbored an abiding sense of living in a providential country with a special mission in the world. But for half a millennium, Russian foreign policy has been characterized by soaring ambitions that have exceeded the country's capabilities. Russia strives to be a great power of the first rank, but finds again and again that Western countries are more powerful. This spurs resentment towards the West for supposedly underappreciating Russia's uniqueness and importance. It also spurs attempts to manage or even overcome the gap with the more powerful West. Russia's rulers invariably look to the state as their instrument to manage or close the gap with the West. They impose coercive state-led modernization to try to beat Russia into being more competitive while also trying to undermine Western power, unity, and resolve. This quest for a strong state, however, invariably devolves into the personal rule of a single individual. One thinks of the Tsarist autocrats from Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great to the Alexanders and the Nicholases, and the communist general secretaries such as Lenin and Stalin, down to today's imitator of the Tsars, Vladimir Putin. Instead of getting a strong state, Russia gets a would-be despot who conflates his personal interests with Russian national interests, conflates the survival of his personal regime with the survival of Russia. And so, despite all the differences over time between Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Russia, this pattern has held. In a paradox, the efforts to build a strong state have invariably led to subverted institutions and capricious personalistic rule, which has only worsened the very geopolitical conundrum, falling behind the West it was supposed to fix. The danger for Russia's neighbors has been evident. Russia has no natural borders except the Pacific Ocean and the Arctic Ocean, and to an extent the enormous mountain range in Russia's south, stretching from the Caucasus to the Himalayas. Russian security has thus traditionally been partly predicated on moving outward in the name of preempting external attack, to seize its neighbors before Western countries could use them as supposed springboards for invasion of Russia. Today, too, smaller countries on Russia's borders are viewed less as potential friends than as potential beachheads for enemies. In fact, this sentiment was only strengthened by the Soviet collapse. As has been made abundantly clear, President Putin and many others among Russia's elites do not recognize the existence of a Ukrainian nation separate from a Russian one. He views all states on Russia's borders, now including independent Ukraine, as weapons in the hands of Western powers intent on wielding them against Russia. Russia's foreign policy orientation, in other words, is almost a condition, a syndrome. But to repeat, it is ultimately a choice. If Russian elites could somehow relinquish their unwinnable competition with the West and acknowledge that Russia not only cannot, but need not be an absolute great power of the first rank, they could set their country on a less costly, more promising course. In this connection, we can think of Britain and France in the first instance, and the Netherlands and Portugal to a lesser extent, although all those cases involved overseas empires. We can also think of Nazi Germany and Hirohito's Japan, which were crushed in war. Until Russia brings its aspirations into line with its actual capabilities, it will not become a, quote, normal country. Even if it can somehow recover the rise in its per capita GDP experienced in the early years of Putin's rule. Whether even a transformed Russia would be accepted into and merge well with Europe is an open question. But the start of the process would need to be a Russian leadership able to get its public to accept permanent retrenchment and agree to embark on an arduous domestic restructuring. You wouldn't be alone in noting that a Russian regime run by Vladimir Putin seems unlikely to ever want to make that case. Someday, Russia's leaders may come to terms with the glaring limits of standing up to the West and seeking to dominate Eurasia. Until then, Russia will remain not another necessary crusade to be won, like the Cold War, but a problem to be managed.
A digital currency is an electronic form of money. Prominent examples include cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and central bank digital currencies, often shortened to CBDCs, which are electronic versions of a nation's official currency and can substitute for physical cash. Many countries around the world are exploring the adoption of CBDCs, but China is the first major country to deploy one widely within its borders, which it calls the ECNY. The ECNY is part of a broader push by Beijing to establish global leadership in new technologies, assert independence from United States power, and intensify control over Chinese society and the financial sector. It will provide China's central bank with a direct window into corporate and personal financial transactions. To the extent that the ECNY becomes heavily used, the central bank will be able to directly trace money flows via bank accounts, ID cards, domestic phone numbers, and potentially even foreign phone numbers. This raises serious concerns about privacy and state surveillance. The ECNY could also be linked to other programs such as the social credit system, which aim to reward and punish Chinese citizens. Given China's heft in global trade and investment, the ECNY may become a currency of choice for transactions between a significant number of foreign governments and businesses and their Chinese counterparts. This could weaken the US-led financial sanctions regime. How has the US government responded? So far, the US administration and the Federal Reserve System have yet to put forward their own visions for the integration of digital currencies into the US domestic and global payment systems. They also have not established norms governing the use of public and private digital currencies domestically or internationally. We believe the United States should embrace the opportunity to shape the future digital economy. First, the United States should move quickly to determine the appropriate nature and role of digital currencies within our economy. Second, the United States should attempt to prevent the ECNY from undermining U.S. geoeconomic and strategic influence, which stems in large part from the dominance of the U.S. dollar in the global economy. And third, the United States should take adequate steps to prevent the global spread of payments arrangements based in Chinese currency, including the ECNY, from threatening individual freedoms and human rights. More broadly, the United States needs to determine how payment systems should work within the digital economy. We need to establish standards that still allow CBDCs, fast payment systems, and private payment methods like the use of stablecoins to safely facilitate various forms of economic transactions. The United States should also position itself as a global leader in the digital currency space. That means creating and promoting a global framework of regulatory principles that is consistent with U.S. expectations concerning consumer protection, privacy, financial anti-crime compliance, financial stability, and the protection of monetary sovereignty. While it is crucial that the United States develop its own CBDC technology, this does not imply that the United States should necessarily deploy its own central bank digital currency. Digital currency designs that maintain the privacy of Americans, defeat illegal payments, and provide for a competitive, inclusive, and innovative payments landscape could come from the public or the private sector. Either way, the Federal Reserve, the Congress, and the executive must act soon.
Since 2013, China has been creating artificial islands in the South China Sea and turning them into military bases. It is attempting to solidify its claims to the strategically vital waters of the South China Sea inside the so-called Nine-Dash Line. It is doing this for economic, military, and domestic political reasons. The vast majority of China, Japan, and South Korea's natural resources are delivered through the South China Sea, making it perhaps the world's most critically important waterway. And by laying claim to islands in the region and building bases from which to project military power, China is making progress toward its goal of becoming the dominant military power in the region. To some, what China does in far-off Southeast Asia doesn't have anything to do with us, but China's behavior should concern us for several reasons. The integrated waters of the Sea of Japan, the Yellow Sea, and the East China Sea and South China Sea are as vital to the history, identity, and trade of Eastern Asia as the Mediterranean is to Europe. Through its waters pass $5 trillion worth of goods every year. China's claims and island-building campaign flouts international law, and Beijing ignored The Hague's International Court of Arbitration when it ruled against China in 2016. China's actions also demonstrate that Beijing is not the reliable partner that it has claimed to be. In 2015, President Xi Jinping nominally pledged that the islands they were building would be used for civilian purposes. Instead, they have been weaponized, flatly contradicting China's claim of a peaceful rise. Further, by militarizing the islands, Beijing is increasing the chances of regional military conflict, since other nations like the Philippines, Brunei, and Taiwan claim some or all of the islands and waters claimed by China. These militarized islands make it easier for China to intimidate its neighbors in the region. In short, China's expansion into the South China Sea threatens international law and regional stability, potentially holds the global economy at risk, and challenges the long-standing principle of the freedom of navigation that the United States has underwritten since the end of World War II. Unfortunately, when we figured out the extent of their operations, our response was to do very little. We put no pressure on China to halt their development. So, what can the United States do about it now? America needs to recover its appreciation of the strategic importance of Asia's inner seas and rimlands if it is to come up with a realistic strategy to preserve both its power and its influence in the Indo-Pacific region. American power must be commensurate with the commitments it has made. Losing one part of the Asiatic Mediterranean will certainly cause allies and partners in other parts to consider either severing ties with the United States or declaring neutrality so as to preserve their own freedom of action. A hard-earned lesson we learned in the aftermath of World War II was that putting even just a little bit of pressure early on could have changed the calculations of our antagonists and prevented further warfare. Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine should remind us that wars between states are still possible. The better course of action is to keep the Asiatic Mediterranean whole, balanced, and stable. Only then can America be certain that the vital rimlands of Asia will remain free from conflict. This means working even more closely with allies and partners, strengthening the Quad and AUKUS initiatives, and ensuring that the U.S. military maintains a credible force that can respond to any attempts by China to close critical sea lanes or coerce American allies. A clear and credible commitment by the United States to reject China's expansion in the South China Sea will pay dividends in peace later on.
When I was a graduate student some 40 years ago, military history had already become unfashionable on campus, and the academic neglect of war is even more acute today. Military history as a discipline has atrophied, with very few professorships, journal articles, or degree programs. After the carnage and savagery of the 20th century's world wars, leaders and governments attempted to refashion international politics with therapeutic organizations to make war a thing of the past. The League of Nations and the United Nations both fostered the hope that global cooperation would lead to collective security and international order. Nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction were supposed to make future conflicts unthinkable. Yet our world today is as violent and conflict-ridden as ever. And whether we like it or not, the central issue in our life is whether we are going to have a war. Therefore, studying military history is, in essence, an attempt to prevent it, or at least ameliorate its catastrophic effects. The importance and challenge of the academic study of war is to elevate general interest into a more serious and widespread understanding, one that seeks answers to such questions as, why do wars break out? How do they end? Why do the winners win and the losers lose? How best to avoid wars or contain their worst effects? A wartime public illiterate about the conflicts of the past can easily find itself paralyzed in the acrimony of the present. Without standards of historical comparison, it will prove ill-equipped to make informed judgments. This concept dates back to at least 400 BC, when Thucydides wrote his history of the Peloponnesian War. By studying that war, Thucydides believed people would be better prepared to interpret future conflicts. Human nature, emotions, and rhetoric remain constant over the centuries and are thus generally predictable. Indeed, by ignoring history, the modern age is free to interpret war as a failure of communication or of diplomacy, as if aggressors don't know exactly what they're doing. Yet it's hard to find many wars that result from miscommunication. Far more often they break out because of ill intent and the absence of deterrence. Military history is as often the story of appeasement as of warmongering. The destructive military careers of Alexander the Great, Caesar, Napoleon, and Hitler would all have ended early had any of the numerous enemies united when the odds favored them. Western societies have often been reluctant to use force to prevent greater future violence. In the 21st century, it's easier than ever to succumb to technological determinism, the idea that science, new weaponry, and globalization have altered the very rules of war. But the study of war tells us that it's highly doubtful that a new weapon will emerge from the Pentagon or anywhere else that will change the very nature of armed conflict. Finally, military history has the moral purpose of educating us about past sacrifices that have secured our present freedom and security. If we know nothing of Shiloh, Verdun, and Okinawa, the crosses in our military cemeteries are just pleasant white stones on lush green lawns. The United States was born through war, reunited by war, and saved from destruction by war. No future generation, however comfortable and affluent, should escape that terrible knowledge. What then can we do to restore the study of war to its proper place in the life of the American mind? The challenge isn't just to reform the graduate school or the professoriate, though that would help. On a deeper level, we need to re-examine the larger forces that have devalued the very idea of military history. We must abandon naive faith that with enough money, education, or good intentions, we can change the nature of mankind so that conflict, as if by fiat, becomes a thing of the past. In the end, the study of war reminds us that we are men, not gods. Some men will always prefer war to peace, and other men who have learned from the past have a moral obligation to stop them.
Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has ignited the largest war in Europe since World War II, indiscriminately spilling the blood of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and innocent civilians. Russian President Vladimir Putin, as well as some analysts in the West, want you to believe that NATO is to blame. Putin and others have claimed that the possibility of a NATO expansion, not the 200,000 Russian soldiers and sailors attacking Ukraine, is the central driver of this war. Blaming the United States and our European allies has become a dominant framework for explaining if not justifying, Moscow's ongoing war against Ukraine. Now, it's true that Ukraine aspires to join NATO someday. The goal is even embedded in the Ukrainian constitution. But while NATO leaders have remained committed to the principle of an open door policy, they also clearly stated prior to the war that Ukraine was not qualified to join NATO. Putin may dislike NATO expansion, but he's genuinely not frightened by it. Russia is the largest army in Europe. NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO has never attacked the Soviet Union or Russia, and it never will. And Putin knows that. The most serious cause of tensions between Russia and the West, and Russia and Ukraine, has been a series of democratic breakthroughs in popular protest throughout the 2000s, which many, including Putin himself, refer to as quote-unquote color revolutions. After each of them, Serbia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004, the Arab Spring in 2011, Russia in 2011, and Ukraine in 2014, Putin has pivoted to more hostile policies towards the United States. Putin, like all dictators, is threatened by democratic ideas, democratic governments, and democratic believers. Putin fears democratic expansion, not NATO expansion. And that is certainly true regarding Ukraine today. Putin can't tolerate a successful and democratic Ukraine on Russia's borders, especially if the Ukrainian people also begin to prosper economically. That would undermine the Kremlin's own regime's stability and proposed rationale for autocracy. Just as Putin cannot allow the Russian people to guide Russia's future, he cannot allow the people of Ukraine to realize the prosperous, independent, and free future that they have voted for and now tragically are fighting for. As a defender of democracy, the United States and countries of the free world have rightly denounced Putin's barbaric invasion and occupation of Ukraine. The free world also has tried to assist President Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, and his army in stopping the invading Russian army. First, by providing military assistance to the Ukrainian army. Second, by providing economic assistance to the Ukrainian government. And third, by implementing comprehensive sanctions against Russian companies and individuals. Ironically, in claiming to invade Ukraine to stop NATO expansion, Putin has triggered greater unity within the alliance than ever before, and at the same time compelled two new countries, Finland and Sweden, to seek membership into the alliance. To date, Putin has failed to achieve most of the goals of his military intervention. His invasion has not united the Russians and Ukrainians, which Putin calls one nation. He failed to, quote, denazify Ukraine by overthrowing the Zelensky government. He failed to demilitarize Ukraine. He has failed to occupy Kiev. So now he's modified his war aims to just focus on capturing Donbass. Tragically, Putin and his army are making incremental gains in achieving that objective. Occupying Donbass, however, has nothing to do with the expansion of NATO. It's straight up old-fashioned imperial conquest, a Russian practice that occurred centuries before NATO even existed. Ukrainians are fighting heroically to not allow imperialism to succeed, to not allow annexation to return to Europe as a normal practice. The United States, democratic Europe, and all countries that believe in a rules-based international order share these same goals, and therefore should do more and better weapons, and more and better sanctions to stop Putin's army, restore Ukrainian sovereignty, and preserve Ukrainian democracy.